The rain fell in sheets across Redemption Valley, turning the main street into a river of mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating Charlotte Hayes' desperate flight through the darkness. Her boots slipped and slid as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned in her lungs. The thunderclap that followed seemed to shake the very ground beneath her feet. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, men's voices calling to each other, boots splashing through puddles. Harrison Thorne's men. They had been waiting for her at the cabin when she returned from visiting Jonathan's grave, three shadows emerging from the darkened corners of the only home she had left in this world. "Nowhere left to run, Mrs. Hayes," one had called as she bolted through the door. "Mr. Thorne says it's time to collect." Charlotte darted between two buildings, searching desperately for somewhere, anywhere to hide. The rain plastered her dark hair to her face and neck, cold rivulets running down her spine. Her plain calico dress, already worn thin from too many washings, now clung to her like a second skin, heavy and restricting. She emerged onto the side street near Sullivan's saloon, the muffled sounds of a piano and drunken laughter floating through the closed doors. For a moment, she considered rushing inside, seeking the protection of a crowd. But she knew better. In Redemption Valley, Harrison Thorne's influence extended everywhere, including perhaps especially places where men's judgment was clouded by whiskey. Footsteps splashed behind her. Charlotte spun around, her back pressed against the rough wooden planks of the saloon's outer wall. Three men approached, spreading out to block any escape route. She recognized them immediately: Finch Davis and Miller Thorne's personal collection crew. "Evening, Mrs. Hayes," Finch said, removing his hat in a mockery of gentlemanly behavior. Rain dripped from the brim. "Mr. Thorne sends his regards. Says to tell you your time's up." Charlotte's hand slipped into her pocket, fingers wrapping around the small knife she carried, her father's old whittling blade. It wouldn't be enough against three men, but she wouldn't go without a fight. "I just need more time," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The claim ain't worth the paper it's written on," Davis interrupted, "and you know it. But Mr. Thorne is a reasonable man. He's offering you a position in his establishment in Prescott." The true meaning hung in the air between them, as palpable as the rain. Thorne's establishment in Prescott was no secret a brothel catering to wealthy men with particular tastes. The thought made Charlotte's stomach turn. "I'd rather die," she whispered, drawing the knife from her pocket. The men laughed, the sound ugly and confident. "Now, don't be hasty," Miller said, stepping closer. "Pretty widow like you, what other options you got? Town's already talking about how you can't manage on your own." Lightning flashed again, and in that brief, stark illumination, Charlotte saw a figure at the far end of the alley, a man on horseback, tall in the saddle, unmoving as stone. In the darkness that followed, she couldn't be sure he was real or just a trick of the light. "Mr. Thorne's been patient," Finch continued, oblivious to the new arrival. "More patient than most would be considering your husband's debts. But patience has its limits." The horseman dismounted in a single fluid motion, the jingle of spurs barely audible over the rain. He approached with the slow, deliberate stride of a man accustomed to being noticed. As he drew closer, Charlotte could make out his features, a hard-planed face, weathered by sun and wind, eyes the color of a storm-tossed sky, and a mouth set in a grim line beneath a neatly trimmed mustache. She recognized him immediately: Gabriel Sterling, owner of Sterling Ridge Ranch. A man whose reputation for cold efficiency was matched only by the whispers of his past as a Union officer during the war. A Northerner in a territory that still harbored deep Southern sympathies. Finch sensed the newcomer's presence and turned, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip. "Sterling," he acknowledged, his oily confidence wavering slightly. "This is private business." Gabriel Sterling didn't respond immediately. His gaze swept over the scene Charlotte pressed against the wall, knife in hand, 3 men hemming her in. His expression revealed nothing but something dangerous flickered in those storm cloud eyes. 3 men cornering a woman in the rain. He finally said, his voice a low baritone that somehow carried over the drumming of raindrops. "Doesn't look like business to me." Charlotte felt a surge of hope quickly tempered by reality. Sterling had no reason to help her. Their few interactions over the years had been formal at best, a nod of acknowledgement at church, a brief exchange at the general store. He was known to be a solitary man, especially since the fever took his wife and daughter 5 years ago. In the face of his imposing presence, Miller and Davis had instinctively stepped back, but Finch held his ground. "Mr. Thorne holds the deed to Mrs. Hayes's property on account of her late husband's debts," Finch explained, attempting to regain control of the situation. "We're simply here to discuss arrangements for settlement." Sterling's gaze shifted to Charlotte, and she saw no warmth there, no promise of salvation. It was the detached, evaluating look of a man weighing a business proposition. The flicker of hope within her extinguished. There would be no rescue here. She was alone, as she had been since they lowered Jonathan into the ground 2 years ago. The knife trembled in her hand, a pathetic defense against the inevitable. Looking directly at Sterling, Charlotte whispered, her voice catching in her throat, "Please, just make it quick." Finch and his companions exchanged amused glances, misinterpreting her words as surrender, but Sterling's eyes never left hers, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring in the rain-soaked night. Then Gabriel Sterling did something unexpected. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that landed with a heavy thud on a nearby rain barrel. "500 in gold," he stated. "That covers Hayes's debt with interest by my calculation." Finch stared at the pouch water already darkening the leather. "Mr. Thorne isn't looking to sell the debt. He's looking for alternative payment. The debt is no longer his concern," Sterling replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "I've purchased it. Mrs. Hayes's obligations are now to me." Charlotte felt the ground shift beneath her feet, though she hadn't moved. What was happening? Why would this man, practically a stranger, intervene on her behalf? Finch glanced at his companions, clearly weighing their options. Everyone in the territory knew Sterling's reputation, not just as a successful rancher, but as a man who had survived the bloodiest battles of the war between the states. The kind of man who didn't make threats, only promises. "Mr. Thorne won't take kindly to interference," Finch warned, but there was hesitation in his voice. "That's between Thorne and me," Sterling replied. "Now, take the money and go." For a moment, it seemed Finch might refuse. His hand hovered near his gun. But something in Sterling's unwavering gaze, perhaps the calm certainty of a man who had faced far worse than 3 hired thugs, made him reconsider. "Very well," Finch said, snatching the pouch from the barrel. "A settled account is a settled account." He shot a venomous glare at Charlotte. "But this ain't over." The 3 men retreated down the alley, disappearing into the rain and darkness. Charlotte remained frozen against the wall, the knife still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. She had escaped Thorne only to find herself indebted to another man, a man as unknown to her as the far side of the moon. "Can you ride?" Sterling asked, his voice betraying no emotion. The question caught her off guard. "Yes, but—" "Then come." He turned and walked back toward his horse, a massive black stallion that seemed as imposing as its master. Charlotte hesitated. "Why are you doing this?" Sterling stopped, but didn't turn around. Rain coursed down his broad shoulders, dripping from the brim of his hat. "We can discuss that somewhere dry, unless you'd prefer to wait for Thorne's men to return with reinforcements." Put that way, Charlotte had little choice. She slipped the knife back into her pocket and followed him to the horse. Sterling mounted first, then extended a hand down to her. She took it after only a moment's hesitation, his grip firm and impersonal as he pulled her up behind him. "Hold on," he instructed. Charlotte tentatively placed her hands on the back of the saddle, careful not to touch him. As the horse moved forward, however, the jolt nearly unseated her, and she was forced to grab Sterling's coat to steady herself. They rode in silence through the storm, leaving Redemption Valley behind. Charlotte knew they were heading toward Sterling Ridge, the sprawling ranch that lay nestled between the foothills to the north. She had never been there, though everyone in the territory knew of it, one of the most successful operations in Arizona, run with precision by a man who spoke little and revealed less. What waited for her there, she couldn't guess. But as the lights of town faded behind them, Charlotte Hayes felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, the dangerous stirring of hope. Sterling Ridge emerged from the darkness like a kingdom unto itself. Charlotte, half frozen from the ride, stared in wonder at the sprawling ranch house, built of sturdy timber and river stone. Lanterns burned in the windows, casting golden light onto the rain-soaked yard. Beyond the main house stood a massive barn bunkhouse and various outbuildings, all speaking of prosperity and permanence in a land where both were hard-won. As they approached, the front door of the house opened, spilling more light into the night. A stout, gray-haired woman emerged, holding a lantern high. "Mr. Sterling," she called, her voice carrying concern. "We were about to send the boys out looking for you in this weather." Gabriel Sterling dismounted in a single fluid motion, then reached up to help Charlotte down. Her legs nearly buckled as she slid to the ground, numbed from the cold and the tension of the ride. "Martha," Sterling acknowledged the woman. "We have a guest. Mrs. Hayes will be staying with us. She needs dry clothes and something warm to drink." Martha's eyes widened slightly as she took in Charlotte's bedraggled appearance, but she recovered quickly. "Of course. Come inside, Mrs. Hayes, before you catch your death." As they entered the house, several ranch hands appeared from the bunkhouse, drawn by the commotion. Their curious gazes followed Charlotte, a disheveled and unexpected addition to their orderly world. An older man with weathered features approached Sterling. "Everything all right, boss?" "Fine, Daniel," Sterling replied. "Take care of Midnight for me, would you? He's had a hard ride." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly warm and well-appointed. Polished wooden floors gleamed in the lamplight, and sturdy, handcrafted furniture filled the rooms. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, and Charlotte found herself drawn to it like a moth, to flame her body trembling with cold and delayed shock. "This way, Mrs. Hayes," Martha said gently, guiding her toward a hallway. "Let's get you into something dry." Charlotte glanced back at Sterling, who was removing his wet coat. "Mr. Sterling, I need to understand—" "Tomorrow," he interrupted, not unkindly. "Get warm, get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." Martha led her to a bedroom at the end of the hall, a space larger than the entire cabin Charlotte had shared with Jonathan. A four-poster bed dominated the room, covered with a patchwork quilt in rich, earthy tones. A washstand held a porcelain basin and pitcher, and a small fireplace already contained a cheerful blaze. "This was Miss Emma's room," Martha explained, opening a wardrobe. "Mr. Sterling's daughter." Something in her tone conveyed the weight of that statement. This wasn't just any room. It was a shrine to someone lost. "I couldn't possibly," Charlotte began. "Nonsense," Martha interrupted, pulling out a simple cotton nightgown. The child's been gone 5 years now. What good does an empty room do anyone? Despite the practical words, there was a softness in the older woman's eyes. Now, you get out of those wet things while I fetch some tea. When Martha returned a short while later, Charlotte was sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in the borrowed nightgown. Her wet clothes hung by the fire to dry, and she'd managed to comb through her damp hair with her fingers. Martha set down a tray containing a steaming cup of tea and a plate of bread and cheese. You look half-starved, if you don't mind my saying so. Charlotte offered a weak smile. It's been a difficult time. So I've heard, Martha replied, pouring the tea. Town talks, you know, about your husband, about the debts. Charlotte's throat tightened. Jonathan was a good man. After the war, things were never quite right for him. Martha nodded, a look of understanding crossing her weathered features. The war changed many men. Some in ways you can see, some in ways you can't. She handed Charlotte the cup. Drink this. It'll warm you up from the inside. As Charlotte sipped the hot, sweet tea, Martha busied herself turning down the bed and adding another log to the fire. The older woman's efficient movements reminded Charlotte of her own mother, gone now for many years. Mrs. Winters, Charlotte said, using the name she'd heard Sterling call the housekeeper, why did Mr. Sterling bring me here? Do you know? Martha paused, considering the question. It's not my place to speak for him, but I will say this. Mr. Sterling is a man of deep principle. Whatever his reasons, they'll be sound. She moved toward the door. Try to get some sleep. Morning comes early at Sterling Ridge. Left alone, Charlotte found herself too exhausted to think clearly, but too overwhelmed to sleep. The events of the evening replayed in her mind: the confrontation in the alley, Sterling's unexpected intervention, the ride through the rain to this place that seemed to exist in a different world from the one she'd known. She set the empty teacup aside and slipped beneath the quilt, its weight comforting around her shoulders. The bed was softer than anything she'd slept on in years, and despite her racing thoughts, her body began to surrender to exhaustion. As she drifted toward sleep, Charlotte's last coherent thought was that she had traded one form of debt for another. The question that remained was whether Gabriel Sterling would prove a more merciful creditor than Harrison Thorne. Morning arrived with the gentle knock of sunlight against the window. Charlotte woke disoriented, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar room with its polished furniture and embroidered curtains. Then memory flooded back: Thorne's men, the rain. Sterling's unexpected rescue. She rose and discovered clean clothes laid out for her, a simple blue dress that had clearly belonged to someone smaller than herself, but altered with expert hands to fit her taller frame. Next to it sat a basin of fresh water, a bar of lavender soap, and a hairbrush. After washing and dressing, Charlotte stood before a small mirror on the wall, scarcely recognizing the woman who stared back. 2 years of grief and struggle had hollowed her cheeks and added shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of restful sleep could erase. The blue dress, though plain, was of finer quality than anything she'd owned since before the war. A soft knock at the door interrupted her self-assessment. Martha entered carrying a tray with coffee and a plate of eggs and bacon. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes. Thought you might want to break your fast before facing the day." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," Charlotte replied, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. "But I should speak with Mr. Sterling. I need to understand. He's been up since dawn checking the north pasture." Martha interrupted, setting down the tray. "Said to tell you he'd see you in his study at 10 o'clock. She glanced at a small clock on the mantel. "That gives you about an hour. Best eat while it's hot." Left alone again, Charlotte ate with the careful restraint of someone who had grown accustomed to rationing. The food was simple, but expertly prepared. The eggs perfectly cooked, the bacon crisp, the coffee strong and hot. It was the most satisfying meal she'd had in months. When she finished, Charlotte made the bed and tidied the room, unwilling to leave it in disarray for Martha to deal with. Then, with nothing else to occupy her, she ventured out to explore her surroundings. The ranch house was larger than it had appeared in the dark, with a central great room flanked by a dining room and kitchen on one side, and what appeared to be private quarters on the other. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating hand-woven rugs and furniture crafted from local timber. Though spacious, there was nothing ostentatious about Sterling Ridge. Everything served a purpose, practical, yet well-made. What struck Charlotte most was the silence. Despite its size, the house felt eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. The few personal touches, a painted landscape here, a carved wooden horse there, only emphasized the absence of the family that had once filled these rooms with life. At precisely 10 o'clock, Charlotte found herself standing outside Sterling's study, gathering her courage before knocking. The door swung open before her knuckles made contact. Gabriel Sterling stood framed in the doorway, his tall figure backlit by the window behind him. In daylight, he looked no less imposing than he had in the rain, broad-shouldered and straight-backed, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. His dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was neatly combed, and his face freshly shaved. Only his eyes, the color of a winter sky, revealed any hint of fatigue. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, stepping aside to allow her entry. "Please, come in." The study reflected its owner, orderly and purposeful. Bookshelves lined one wall filled with volumes on ranching medicine and military history. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with maps and ledgers. Behind it hung a framed officer's commission bearing the seal of the Union Army. Sterling gestured to a chair before the desk. "Please sit." Charlotte remained standing. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your intervention last night, but I need to understand why you involved yourself in my affairs. We hardly know each other." A flicker of something respect perhaps crossed his features. "Direct and to the point." "Good." He moved behind his desk, but didn't sit. "I knew your husband, Mrs. Hayes." This was unexpected. "Jonathan never mentioned knowing you." "Not socially," Sterling clarified. "During the war, Lieutenant Jonathan Hayes served under my command at Gettysburg." Charlotte felt the floor tilt beneath her. Jonathan had rarely spoken of his time in the Union Army, and when he did, it was in nightmares that left him sweating and shouting in the dark. "You were his commanding officer?" she asked, steadying herself against the back of the chair. Sterling nodded once. "Captain Gabriel Sterling, 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment." The significance wasn't lost on Charlotte. The 20th Maine had become legendary for their defense of Little Round Top, a critical position that, had it fallen, might have changed the outcome of the entire battle, perhaps even the war itself. "Jonathan spoke little of Gettysburg," she said carefully. "Many men don't," Sterling replied, his tone neutral. "But your husband's actions that day saved the lives of many in our company, including my own." Charlotte slowly sank into the chair, her legs no longer able to support her. "What are you saying?" Sterling's gaze was steady, direct. "I'm saying I owe your husband a debt that can never be fully repaid. When I learned of his passing and your subsequent difficulties, I felt obligated to help. You've been watching me." The idea was unsettling. "I keep informed about the happenings in Redemption Valley," he corrected. "It's necessary for my business interests. When I heard Thorne was pressuring the widow of one of my former soldiers, I made inquiries. Charlotte's mind raced, trying to process this new information. So last night was the repayment of a debt of honor. Sterling finished. Nothing more. The explanation made sense, yet something about it felt incomplete. And now, she asked, what happens now that you own my husband's debt? Sterling looked out the window for a moment, his profile sharp against the morning light. When he turned back, his expression was resolute. I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Hayes, one that would settle the debt and provide you with security. A chill ran through Charlotte, despite the warmth of the room. What kind of proposition? Marriage. Sterling stated the word, falling between them like a stone. Charlotte stared at him, certain she had misheard. I beg your pardon. A marriage of convenience. He clarified, his tone businesslike. In name and legal standing only. It would serve three purposes. First, it would protect you from Thorne, who cannot pursue a married woman without severe legal and social consequences. Second, it would silence any rumors about your presence at Sterling Ridge, preserving both our reputations. And third, he paused, something almost vulnerable flickering across his features. It would fulfill my promise to Jonathan. Promise? Charlotte echoed, feeling as though she were dreaming. What promise? Sterling's gaze never wavered. The last words your husband spoke to me, as he lay wounded on that hill in Pennsylvania, were a request to look after his wife if he didn't make it home. At the time, I assured him he would recover. I was wrong. Charlotte felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Jonathan survived Gettysburg. He came home. He lived for 8 more years. Yeah, Sterling acknowledged. And in those years, I lost track of him, lost track of you. It wasn't until after his death that I learned he had settled in Arizona territory. By then, he didn't complete the thought, but Charlotte understood. By then, Jonathan had already accumulated the debts that now threatened to destroy her. So this is about honor, she said quietly. Fulfilling a battlefield promise made to a dying man who didn't actually die. Yes, Sterling replied simply. Charlotte rose from the chair and walked to the window, needing space to think. Outside, she could see ranch hands moving about their duties, a world operating with precision and purpose. So different from her own life, which had been unraveling thread by thread since Jonathan's death. And if I refuse, she asked without turning. Then the debt remains, but the terms will be far more lenient than Thorne's, Sterling answered. You would have time to establish yourself, find suitable employment. As what? Charlotte asked, facing him now. A seamstress, a laundress, a schoolteacher. Redemption Valley has all of those already, and none pay enough to settle a debt of $500. She shook her head. You know as well as I do that a woman alone has few respectable options in this territory. Sterling didn't argue the point. The choice is yours, Mrs. Hayes. I won't force you into an arrangement that distresses you. Charlotte studied him, this stranger who had inserted himself into her life with such authority. What did she really know about Gabriel Sterling beyond the whispers and rumors that he ran a successful ranch, that he had lost his family to fever, that he had fought for the Union in a territory where many still harbored Confederate sympathies, and now that he had known Jonathan, had commanded him in battle, had received his dying wish, a wish Jonathan himself had apparently forgotten once he recovered from his wounds. It was absurd, this proposal. Yet, what alternative did she have? Return to a cabin on the verge of collapse, with Thorne's men surely waiting. Accept charity from townsfolk who already viewed her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. "This marriage," she said slowly, "would be in name only." Sterling nodded. "You would have your own quarters, your own privacy. I ask only that you assist in managing the household affairs, as Martha isn't getting any younger. In return, you would have security, comfort, and protection under my name. And when the debt is paid, you would be free to go or stay as you choose," he replied, "though a legal dissolution of marriage would require travel to Tucson and considerable paperwork." Charlotte took a deep breath, weighing her limited options. A loveless marriage to a man she barely knew in exchange for safety and stability. Was it so different from many other marriages arranged for convenience or necessity rather than affection? "I have conditions," she said finally. Something like surprise flickered in Sterling's eyes. "Name them." "First, I want to work for my keep, not just managing the household, but contributing in meaningful ways. I'm educated. I can read, write, and keep accounts." Sterling considered this. "Agreed. I could use assistance with the ledgers. Second, I want to know the truth about Jonathan's death. Thorne's men mentioned his debts, but the only debt I know of was the mortgage on our land. $500 seems excessive for that." Sterling's expression remained neutral. "I can make inquiries." "And third," Charlotte continued, her voice steady, despite the hammering of her heart, "I want your word that this arrangement will remain strictly business. No expectations beyond what we've discussed." "You have it," Sterling replied without hesitation. "I buried any such intentions with my wife and daughter 5 years ago." The bluntness of his response should have been reassuring. Instead, it left Charlotte with an unexpected hollow feeling. Not disappointment, certainly not that, but perhaps the recognition of a shared emptiness, a void left by those they had loved and lost. "Then I accept your proposition, Mr. Sterling," she said, extending her hand as she would for any business arrangement. He took it, his grip firm but not crushing. His hand was warm, calloused from work, steady as he shook hers once and released it. "We'll see Judge Miller tomorrow," Sterling said, all practicality now that the decision was made. "Until then, Martha will help you settle in and acquire suitable clothing." "I have clothes at my cabin," Charlotte protested. "Too dangerous," Sterling countered. "Thorne will be watching the place. I'll send Daniel to retrieve any personal items of value once the situation has calmed." The efficiency with which he approached her life was both reassuring and unsettling. Charlotte wondered what she had just agreed to. Was this sanctuary or another form of cage, albeit a more comfortable one? As if sensing her uncertainty, Sterling added, "This isn't how either of us imagined our lives would unfold, Mrs. Hayes, but sometimes survival requires compromise." With those words, he returned his attention to the papers on his desk, a clear dismissal. Charlotte left the study, closing the door quietly behind her. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, the reality of her decision washing over her. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Gabriel Sterling, a wife in name only to a man bound by a promise to a ghost. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of as a girl in Boston, nor the one she had built with Jonathan in their early happier days, but it was a life. And after 2 years of watching everything she loved slip through her fingers like water, Charlotte Hayes had learned to be grateful for whatever she could hold on to. The wedding, if it could be called that, took place in Judge Miller's office in Redemption Valley the following afternoon. The room smelled of dust, tobacco, and old paper, a fitting backdrop for a ceremony stripped of all romance or sentiment. Charlotte wore a simple green dress Martha had altered for her cut, from fabric intended for new curtains in the ranch house. Her hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore no jewelry save a small silver locket containing a miniature photograph of Jonathan hidden beneath the high collar of her dress. Gabriel Sterling stood beside her in a dark suit freshly pressed, but bearing signs of age around the cuffs and collar. His expression was solemn, almost grave, as Judge Miller read the brief civil ceremony from a worn book. The only witnesses were Martha, who had insisted on accompanying them for propriety's sake, and Daniel Hayes Sterling's foreman, whose weathered face betrayed nothing of his thoughts about this unexpected union. When it came time for the vows, Charlotte's voice was steady, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. "I do," a promise made not from love or even affection, but from desperate pragmatism. Sterling's "I do" was equally devoid of emotion, a business transaction finalized with two simple words. Judge Miller, a man who had seen enough of frontier life to be surprised by very little, concluded the ceremony with professional efficiency. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He paused, then added with a hint of awkwardness, "You may kiss the bride." Charlotte tensed, having not considered this traditional conclusion to the ceremony. Sterling seemed equally caught off guard. After a moment's hesitation, he leaned forward and placed a brief, impersonal kiss on her cheek, his lips barely making contact with her skin. With that, it was done. Charlotte Hayes became Charlotte Sterling. Her identity altered with the stroke of a pen on a marriage certificate. The debt that had threatened to destroy her was now legally transferred to her new husband, a man who had been a stranger 3 days ago. As they left the judge's office, Charlotte was acutely aware of the curious stares from passers-by. News traveled fast in small towns, and by now everyone in Redemption Valley would know of the sudden marriage between the widow Hayes and the solitary rancher from Sterling Ridge. "Mrs. Sterling." The voice stopped Charlotte in her tracks. She turned to see Harrison Thorne approaching his expensive suit, immaculate despite the dusty street, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. Beside her, she felt Sterling stiffen. "Mr. Thorne," Charlotte acknowledged, fighting to keep her voice level. "What a delightful surprise," Thorne said, his gaze shifting between her and Sterling. "I had no idea congratulations were in order." "Quite the whirlwind courtship, wasn't it?" The implication was clear in his tone. Before Charlotte could respond, Sterling stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice cool but controlled, "I understand there was some confusion regarding Mrs. Sterling's financial obligations. I trust my payment has resolved the matter to your satisfaction." Thorne's smile tightened. Of course. Business is business, after all." His gaze slid back to Charlotte. "Though I must say, Mrs. Sterling, I'm surprised by your choice. I would have thought a woman of your sensitivity might seek a gentler environment than a cattle ranch run by a former Union officer." The deliberate emphasis on Union wasn't lost on anyone. In Redemption Valley, where many residents had fled the South after the war, such distinctions still carried weight. "My husband provides exactly the environment I need, Mr. Thorne," Charlotte replied, deliberately taking Sterling's arm. "Security, respect, and honesty qualities I've found rare in recent encounters." Thorne's smile vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating look that sent a chill through Charlotte despite the afternoon heat. "Indeed. Well, I wish you both every happiness." He tipped his hat. "Though, in my experience, hasty decisions often lead to unfortunate consequences." With that parting remark, he continued down the street, his tailored coat fluttering in the dry Arizona breeze. "He's not finished with this," Charlotte murmured, watching Thorne's retreating figure. "No," Sterling agreed, his voice low. "But he'll find I'm not easily intimidated." They returned to Sterling Ridge in the wagon Martha and Daniel had brought to town, the journey passing mostly in silence. Charlotte watched the landscape roll by, rugged, beautiful, and unforgiving, much like the man she had just married. The ranch hands were waiting when they arrived, lined up outside the main house, in a show of respect that clearly surprised Sterling. Daniel must have sent word ahead. "Speech, boss," someone called out, prompting murmurs of agreement from the others. Sterling hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "Thank you for this welcome. As you can see, Mrs. Hayes, Mrs. Sterling will be joining our household permanently. I expect you all to show her the same respect you show me." It was brief and to the point, typical of the man himself. The ranch hands nodded and dispersed, returning to their duties, with only a few curious glances back at Charlotte. Inside the house, Martha had prepared a small celebration, a special dinner and a cake decorated with wildflowers from the meadow beyond the barn. It was a touching gesture, an attempt to bring some warmth and normalcy to what was in reality a cold business arrangement. As evening fell, however, the inevitable awkwardness that had been held at bay by practicalities could no longer be avoided. Charlotte stood in the bedroom that had been Emma's, now officially hers, wondering what happened next. Would Sterling expect her to move to the master bedroom? The thought made her stomach knot with anxiety. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sterling stood in the hallway, his tall frame silhouetted against the lamplight. "Mrs. Sterling?" He began, the new name still awkward on his tongue. "I wanted to inform you that I've had your things moved to the room across the hall. It's larger and was intended as the mistress's chamber when the house was built." Charlotte nodded, relieved. "Thank you. And where will you be?" "My quarters remain at the end of the hall," he replied. "As we discussed, this arrangement is for mutual benefit and protection. I have no expectation of anything beyond that." His formality was both reassuring and strangely disappointing. Charlotte had never considered herself a romantic life with Jonathan had cured her of such notions, yet there was something almost clinical about Sterling's approach that left her feeling like a problem he had solved rather than a woman he had married. "I appreciate your clarity," she said, matching his formality. "And I want you to know that I intend to earn my keep here. I'm not afraid of hard work." Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "I never thought you were Mrs. Sterling. We'll discuss your duties tomorrow. For now, get some rest. It's been a consequential day." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall. Charlotte closed her door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. She was married again, a wife without a husband in any real sense, safe from Thorne's immediate threats but bound to a stranger by a contract more binding than any debt. As she changed for bed, her fingers brushed against the locket at her throat. Opening it, she gazed at Jonathan's face, captured in happier times before the war, before the nightmares, before whatever debts had driven him to that final desperate act. "What would you think of this arrangement, Jonathan?" she whispered to the image. "Is this what you wanted when you asked him to look after me?" The photograph offered no answers, only the frozen smile of a man who had carried more burdens than she had ever fully understood. Charlotte closed the locket and slipped beneath the covers of her new bed, in her new room, in her new life. Outside, the night sounds of Sterling Ridge, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft hooting of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine trees created a lullaby both foreign and soothing. She had survived another day. In the harsh reality of the Arizona territory, sometimes that was victory enough. Days bled into weeks as Charlotte adjusted to life at Sterling Ridge. The ranch operated with military precision, each hand knowing his duties and executing them without complaint, under Daniel's watchful eye. Even the household ran like clockwork, with Martha overseeing every detail from meals to laundry with quiet efficiency. Charlotte found her place within this ordered world slowly but deliberately. Her first week was spent learning the rhythms of the ranch, when meals were served, which days the supplies came from town, how the water system worked, where everything was stored. Martha proved a patient teacher, though her initial reserve suggested some skepticism about this sudden marriage. "You'll find Mr. Sterling is a man of habit," Martha explained as they worked together in the kitchen. "Breakfast at 6 sharp, dinner at noon, for the hands' supper at 7. He takes coffee. Black tolerates only the smallest amount of sugar in anything, and would rather have simple food done well than fancy dishes done poorly." Charlotte absorbed these details, building a mental portrait of the man she had married yet scarcely knew. She saw little of Sterling himself those first days he left before dawn, and often returned after dark, the demands of the ranch intensified by spring calving season. When their paths did cross, their interactions were cordial but brief. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling." "How was your day, Mrs. Sterling?" "Is there anything you require, Mrs. Sterling? Always formal, always respectful, always distant." It was during her second week that Charlotte began to assert herself more directly. She approached Sterling one evening as he sat in his study reviewing the ranch ledgers by lamplight. "I'd like to take on the accounts," she stated without preamble. Sterling looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "The accounts?" "Yeah." Charlotte stepped into the room, confidence in her posture despite the uncertainty she felt. "My father was an accountant in Boston. He taught me bookkeeping from the time I was 12. I'm good with numbers." Sterling studied her for a moment, then gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "These are complex records. Cattle tallies, supply costs, wages, feed calculations, market prices." "I understand," Charlotte replied, taking the offered seat. "But from what I've seen of your ledger system, it could benefit from reorganization. No disrespect intended," she added hastily. To her surprise, a hint of amusement flickered across Sterling's usually stoic features. "None taken. I'm a rancher, not an accountant." He pushed one of the leather-bound books toward her. "Show me what you mean." Charlotte opened the ledger quickly, identifying the issues. "You're tracking expenses by date rather than category, which makes it difficult to see patterns or identify areas where costs might be reduced." She flipped through several pages. "And your revenue calculations don't account for market fluctuations when planning future sales." She glanced up to find Sterling watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. It wasn't desire in his gaze, but something almost as intimate recognition. "You've studied these already," he observed. Charlotte nodded. "I hope you don't mind. The books were here in the study, and I wanted to make yourself useful," he finished for her. He leaned back in his chair, considering. "Very well, Mrs. Sterling. The accounts are yours. Report to me weekly on your findings." It was a small victory, but significant. For the first time since arriving at Sterling Ridge, Charlotte felt she had something of value to offer beyond her presence as a nominal wife. The ledgers revealed more than just the ranch's financial health. Through them, Charlotte began to understand the scope of Sterling's operation, the careful balance he maintained between cattle-breeding land management and market timing. Sterling Ridge wasn't just successful. It was innovative, employing techniques that many other ranchers in the territory had yet to adopt. She also discovered irregularities, small discrepancies in supply costs, slight variations between cattle counts in different records, payments to vendors in Prescott that seemed excessive for the goods received. Individually, these might be dismissed as clerical errors. Together, they suggested something more deliberate. When Charlotte brought her concerns to Sterling, she found him in the barn checking a pregnant heifer that had been showing signs of distress. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hands gentle as they examined the animal. "Mr. Sterling," she began, clutching the ledger to her chest. "I found something concerning in the accounts." He glanced up, then returned his attention to the heifer. "What kind of concerning?" "The kind that suggests someone is stealing from you," Charlotte replied. "Systematically and carefully." That got his full attention. He straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Show me." She opened the ledger, pointing to the entries she had flagged. "Here and here. The freight costs from Bartow Shipping Line, you paid them twice last month for the same delivery. And these cattle counts from the South Pasture Daniels tally shows 320 head, but the final sale document from the stockyard only accounts for 300. Sterling's expression darkened as he studied the figures. "Could be mistakes." 20 head of cattle don't just vanish by mistake," Charlotte countered. "And there are too many errors, all benefiting the same few parties." Sterling was silent for a moment, his jaw tight. "You think it's one of my men?" "I think someone is helping your money, and cattle disappear," Charlotte said carefully. "Whether it's someone here or someone you do business with, I can't say yet." He closed the ledger, his movements deliberate. "Keep looking. Note every discrepancy, no matter how small. But tell no one else about this, not even Martha or Daniel. Not until we know more." The "we" wasn't lost on Charlotte. For the first time, Sterling was treating her as a partner rather than an obligation. It was a subtle shift, but significant. As she turned to leave, Sterling called after her. "Mrs. Sterling." She paused, looking back. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your thoroughness." It wasn't effusive praise, but coming from Gabriel Sterling, it felt momentous. That night at supper, Charlotte noticed Sterling watching her with a new awareness, as if seeing her properly for the first time. The realization was both gratifying and unsettling. She had wanted to prove her worth, yes, but she hadn't expected the warm flutter in her stomach when he looked at her with something approaching respect. This was business, she reminded herself sternly. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. Any other feelings would only complicate an already complex situation. Yet, as spring bloomed across Sterling Ridge, bringing new life to the land, Charlotte couldn't help but wonder if something unexpected was also taking root between her and the solemn man who had married her to repay a debt. The first significant test of their unusual arrangement came 3 weeks after the wedding, when Reverend Thomas Whitaker paid an unexpected visit to Sterling Ridge. The minister from Redemption Valley's small church was a former Confederate chaplain, his sympathies still firmly with the South, despite the war's end more than a decade ago. Charlotte was in the garden behind the house, planting herbs with Martha's guidance, when the Reverend's buggy came up the drive. She straightened, brushing soil from her hands, as Gabriel emerged from the barn to greet the visitor. "Reverend," Gabriel acknowledged, his tone neutral, as he helped the older man down from the buggy. "This is unexpected." Whitaker, a tall, thin man with a silver beard and penetrating blue eyes, removed his hat. "Mr. Sterling, I hope I'm not intruding, but as shepherd to my flock, I felt it my duty to call upon you and your new bride. We missed you at services this past Sunday." The implication was clear: a proper married couple would have attended church to receive the congregation's blessing. Charlotte approached, wiping her hands on her apron, aware of the scrutiny in the minister's gaze. "Reverend Whitaker," she greeted him, "how kind of you to visit." The Reverend's eyes assessed her carefully. "Mrs. Sterling, I trust you're settling into your new role." Something in his tone, a hint of judgment perhaps, made Charlotte bristle inwardly, though she maintained a polite smile. "Very well, thank you. Sterling Ridge is a beautiful property." "Indeed it is," Whitaker agreed, his gaze moving between her and Gabriel. "A fine establishment for a family, which is partly why I've come." Your marriage was rather sudden. Some in town have expressed concern about the circumstances. Gabriel's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. My personal affairs are not the town's concern, Reverend. Perhaps not, Whitaker conceded. But as a man of God, I am concerned with the spiritual welfare of all in my parish. A civil ceremony before Judge Miller lacks the sanctification of holy matrimony. Charlotte felt a flash of anger on Gabriel's behalf. This was barely disguised condemnation, not pastoral concern. We appreciate your thought, Reverend, she interjected smoothly, moving to stand beside Gabriel. But Mr. Sterling and I are quite content with our arrangement as it stands. Whitaker's bushy eyebrows rose slightly at her choice of words. Arrangement, an interesting term for a marriage, Mrs. Sterling. Before Charlotte could respond, Gabriel placed a hand lightly at the small of her back, their first physical contact since the brief kiss at their wedding. The gesture was clearly for Whitaker's benefit, yet Charlotte felt an unexpected warmth spread from the point of contact. What my wife means, Gabriel said firmly, is that our marriage is our own business. While we respect your position, Reverend, we do not require your approval. Tension crackled in the air between the two men, a history Charlotte sensed, but didn't fully understand. Whitaker broke the silence first, his lips thinning into a tight smile. Of course, forgive an old man's presumption. He turned to Charlotte. Nevertheless, Mrs. Sterling, I hope you'll consider attending services. The Women's Auxiliary would welcome you, I'm sure. And in a place like Redemption Valley, community connections can be valuable. The words seemed innocent enough, but Charlotte detected a subtle warning. In a small frontier town, social isolation could be dangerous, especially for a woman. I'll certainly consider it, she replied diplomatically. Martha appeared at the doorway of the house. I've prepared refreshments if the Reverend would care to join us. The invitation diffused some of the tension, and they moved into the house's front parlor, where Martha had laid out coffee and fresh-baked bread with honey. The conversation turned to safer topics: the weather, the condition of the roads, the progress of the new schoolhouse in town. Throughout the visit, Gabriel maintained a careful proximity to Charlotte, occasionally touching her arm or shoulder in a convincing display of husbandly attention. Each contact, though performative, sent a disconcerting flutter through her chest. When Whitaker finally took his leave an hour later, Charlotte felt exhausted from the effort of maintaining the charade. She and Gabriel stood side by side on the porch, watching the buggy disappear down the drive. He doesn't approve of you, Charlotte observed once the Reverend was out of earshot. Few in Redemption Valley do, Gabriel replied matter-of-factly. A Northerner who fought for the Union is barely tolerated. A successful Northerner even less so. Charlotte glanced at him. Is that why you live so isolated here? Because of the war? Gabriel was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. The war is part of it, but people like Whitaker disapproved of me long before they knew which side I fought for. Whiteit, he turned to her, then his expression unreadable. Because I believe a man should be judged by his actions, not his origins or allegiances. Because I hire Apache and Mexican hands alongside whites. Because I refused to join Thorne's business association when I first established Sterling Ridge. A muscle tightened in his jaw. And because my wife came from the Cheyenne tribe before she was educated in the East. The revelation stunned Charlotte. Marie was Native American. Gabriel nodded once.
Her father was a Cheyenne chief who sent her to a missionary school in Pennsylvania, hoping she would learn the white man's ways and help protect their people. That's where we met after the war. His voice softened slightly. She was the most intelligent, determined woman I'd ever known.
It was the most personal information Gabriel had shared since their marriage, offering Charlotte a glimpse of the man behind the stoic facade. She found herself wanting to know more about Marie, about their life together, about the child they had lost. But Gabriel was already turning toward the house, the brief moment of openness closing like a shutter. "Whitaker's visit reminds me we should discuss your attendance at church. Your absence will only fuel gossip." Just like that, they were back to practicalities. Charlotte suppressed a sigh. "I'll go this Sunday, if you think it best." "I do." He paused at the door. And Charlotte, it was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his deep voice made her pulse quicken inexplicably. "Yes. Thank you for how you handled Whitaker. You played your part well." With that, he disappeared into the house, leaving Charlotte on the porch, with the strange sensation that the lines between performance and reality were beginning to blur. That night, unable to sleep, Charlotte found herself drawn to the window of her bedroom. The moon hung low over Sterling Ridge, bathing the landscape in silver light. In the distance, she could make out a solitary figure standing near the small family cemetery where Marie and Emma Sterling were buried. Gabriel stood motionless, a sentinel in the moonlight, his shoulders bearing the invisible weight of grief and memory. The sight stirred something in Charlotte's chest, not pity but recognition. She knew that solitude, that silent communion with ghosts. For the first time since arriving at Sterling Ridge, Charlotte allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. She and Gabriel Sterling were more alike than different, two survivors, navigating the aftermath of love and loss, bound together by circumstance, but separated by walls of their own making. The realization brought no comfort, only questions. Chief among them, was it possible to build something real from an arrangement founded on obligation and necessity? And if so, was she brave enough or foolish enough to try? Charlotte turned away from the window, leaving Gabriel to his private vigil. Some boundaries, she knew, were not yet ready to be crossed. But as spring deepened toward summer across Sterling Ridge, those boundaries would be tested in ways neither of them could anticipate. The Sunday morning that Charlotte first attended church, as Mrs. Gabriel Sterling, dawned clear and bright, the Arizona sky a flawless expanse of blue. She dressed with particular care in a sage-green dress Martha had finished, altering the previous evening, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest bonnet. Gabriel waited for her in the front room, dressed in a dark suit that, like everything he owned, was well made, but showing signs of age. He looked uncomfortable in the formal attire, as if the collar were too tight, or the shoulders too confining. "You look," he began when Charlotte appeared, then seemed to struggle for an appropriate word. "Suitable," he finally concluded. Charlotte bit back a smile at his awkward attempt at a compliment. "Thank you, as do you." The drive to Redemption Valley took nearly an hour, during which they spoke little. Gabriel handled the horses with the same quiet competence he brought to all tasks, while Charlotte rehearsed in her mind how she would present herself to the curious congregation. "They'll have questions," Gabriel said, suddenly breaking the lengthy silence as the town came into view. "I'm prepared," Charlotte assured him, though her stomach knotted with apprehension. "We met through mutual acquaintances, reconnected when I fell on hard times and discovered a shared appreciation for practical matters." Gabriel glanced at her, a hint of approval in his expression. Simple, plausible, and close enough to the truth to be convincing. Without mentioning Jonathan's battlefield promise or Thorne's threats, Charlotte added, "Precisely." Gabriel returned his attention to the road. "Reverend Whitaker will watch us closely. He's perceptive." "And not your admirer," Charlotte observed. A grimace that might almost have been a smile crossed Gabriel's face. "No, but his opinion matters in Redemption Valley." The small white church at the edge of town was already surrounded by wagons and horses when they arrived. Charlotte felt the weight of eyes upon them as Gabriel helped her down from their wagon, his hand lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary, another performance for their audience. They entered the church together, Gabriel's hand at the small of her back, and the buzz of conversation dimmed noticeably. Charlotte kept her chin up, her expression pleasant, but reserved, as she nodded greetings to the townsfolk who stared with undisguised curiosity. Reverend Whitaker stood near the altar, observing their entrance with shrewd eyes. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement as Gabriel guided Charlotte to a pew near the back. The service proceeded normally with hymns and prayers, followed by a sermon on the virtues of patience and long-suffering that seemed pointed in their direction. Throughout, Charlotte was acutely aware of the sidelong glances and whispered comments from the congregation. When the service concluded, there was no escape from the social obligations that followed. Ladies who had barely acknowledged Charlotte during her 2 years as Jonathan's widow now approached with eager smiles and probing questions. "Mrs. Sterling, what a lovely surprise to see you here," said Mrs. Abernathy, the wife of the town's most prosperous merchant. "Your marriage was so unexpected." "The best blessings often are," Charlotte replied with a serene smile. "And how are you finding life at Sterling Ridge?" inquired Mrs. Lawson, whose husband ran the local sawmill. "It must be quite an adjustment." "It's a beautiful property," Charlotte answered truthfully. "Mr. Sterling has built something remarkable there." "Indeed," Mrs. Abernathy agreed, her eyes sharp beneath her flowered bonnet. "Though one does wonder about the hastiness of your arrangement. Barely a month after poor Jonathan's debts came due." The implication was clear, and Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but anger. Before she could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Some of us find judgment less interesting than kindness, Mrs. Abernathy." Charlotte turned to see a young woman with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes. She was plainly dressed, but carried herself with quiet dignity. "Miss Nighthawk," Mrs. Abernathy acknowledged, her tone cooling several degrees. "I wasn't aware you attended Reverend Whitaker's services." "Occasionally," the woman replied, "when I feel the congregation might benefit from a diverse perspective." She turned to Charlotte with a genuine smile. "Sarah Nighthawk. My father was Apache, my mother Irish. I teach at the small school by the creek." "Charlotte Sterling," Charlotte replied, immediately warming to the young woman. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Abernathy and Mrs." Lawson exchanged meaningful glances before making excuses to move on, leaving Charlotte alone with Sarah. "Thank you," Charlotte said once they were out of earshot. "That was kind of you." Sarah's smile was wry. "I recognize the look of a woman being circled by wolves. Besides, I know what it's like to be the subject of Redemption Valley's gossip." Before Charlotte could respond, Gabriel appeared at her side, having extricated himself from a conversation with several ranchers. His expression was guarded as he acknowledged Sarah. "Miss Nighthawk, I trust you're well." "Well enough, Mr. Sterling," Sarah replied. "I was just introducing myself to your wife." Gabriel nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. "Sarah's school takes students other establishments won't," he explained to Charlotte, "including children from the Apache settlement and Mexican families." "Not everyone approves," Sarah added, "but education shouldn't be restricted by heritage." Charlotte felt an immediate kinship with this woman who clearly stood apart from Redemption Valley's social hierarchy. "Perhaps I could visit your school sometime. I taught briefly in Boston before my marriage to Jonathan." "I'd welcome the company," Sarah replied warmly. "And perhaps an extra pair of hands. 20 children of different ages and backgrounds make for lively days." Their conversation was interrupted by Reverend Whitaker's approach. The minister's expression was pleasant, but his eyes remained evaluating as he greeted them. "Mrs. Sterling, how good to see you joining our congregation. I trust you found the service enlightening." "Very much so, Reverend," Charlotte replied diplomatically. Whitaker turned to Gabriel. "And you, Mr. Sterling. It's been some time since you attended worship." "My faith is private, Reverend," Gabriel replied evenly, "but I appreciate your concern for my spiritual welfare." Something passed between the two men, an old tension Charlotte couldn't quite decipher. Sarah, however, seemed to understand perfectly, as she smoothly changed the subject. "Reverend, I wanted to thank you for the books you donated to the school. The children are particularly enjoying the illustrated Bible stories." Whitaker's attention shifted to Sarah, his expression softening slightly. "Education is a worthy cause, Miss Nighthawk, even if we occasionally disagree on its breadth." The conversation continued for several more minutes before Gabriel made their excuses, guiding Charlotte back to their wagon. As they prepared to depart, Sarah approached once more. "Mrs. Sterling, please do visit the school. Tuesdays and Thursdays are best. We have reading circles in the afternoon." "I will," Charlotte promised, genuinely looking forward to it. As they drove away from the church, Charlotte noticed Gabriel's shoulders gradually relaxing, as if he were shedding a heavy coat. "You don't enjoy town," she observed. "I prefer Sterling Ridge," he replied simply. "Sarah Nighthawk seems interesting," Charlotte ventured after a moment. "You know her well." Gabriel kept his eyes on the road. "I helped fund her school when the town council refused. Many here consider education for Apache and Mexican children unnecessary or inappropriate. But you don't." He glanced at her briefly. "No. My late wife taught me that intelligence and character aren't determined by birth or background." Another small revelation about the man she had married. Charlotte filed it away with the others, slowly assembling a more complete picture of Gabriel Sterling, a man whose gruff exterior concealed more complexity than she had initially assumed. "The ladies of the congregation have certainly formed their opinions about our marriage," she said, changing the subject. "Does that bother you?" Charlotte considered the question. "Not for myself. I've been the subject of gossip since Jonathan's death. But I wonder if it might affect your standing in the community, your business dealings." Gabriel's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "My standing was compromised long before you arrived, Mrs. Sterling. The only opinions that matter to me are those of the people who work for me and the businesses who trade with me fairly." He paused. "And yours, I suppose, given our arrangement." It wasn't quite a declaration of caring, but it was more than Charlotte had expected. She looked out at the passing landscape, wondering if the careful boundaries they had established were beginning to blur. "Thank you for accompanying me today," Gabriel said, after another long silence. "Your presence simplified things." Charlotte understood what he meant. As a married couple attending church, they had taken a step toward legitimizing their unusual arrangement in the eyes of the community. The gossip wouldn't stop, but it would eventually lose its novelty. "We're partners in this," she replied. "That was our agreement." Gabriel nodded, and they completed the journey to Sterling Ridge in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts about the nature of their partnership and where the boundaries truly lay. The following Tuesday, true to her word, Charlotte visited Sarah Nighthawk's school. Gabriel provided a horse, a gentle mare named Willow, and directions to the small structure near the creek that marked the edge of town. The school proved to be little more than a large single-room cabin with a wood stove at one end and rows of mismatched benches and tables arranged to face a small blackboard. Despite its humble appearance, the space was clean, with children's drawings pinned to the walls and shelves of well-worn books along one side. Sarah was in the midst of a geography lesson when Charlotte arrived pointing to a large map of the United States, while her students, a diverse group ranging from perhaps 5 to 15 years old, followed along attentively. "Mrs. Sterling," Sarah greeted her warmly when the lesson concluded. "Children, this is Mrs. Charlotte Sterling. She's going to join us for reading circles this afternoon." The children regarded Charlotte with varying degrees of curiosity and shyness. A small girl with dark braids and solemn eyes approached, offering a wildflower she must have picked during the midday break. "Thank you," Charlotte said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "What's your name?" "Louisa," the child replied softly. "Miss Nighthawk says you come from a big city in the east. Is it true they have buildings tall as mountains?" Charlotte smiled. "Not quite as tall as mountains, but certainly taller than anything in Redemption Valley. Perhaps during reading circle I could tell you all a bit about Boston." Louisa nodded eagerly and returned to her seat, prompting several other children to whisper excitedly among themselves. The afternoon passed quickly, with Charlotte leading one group through a simple story, while Sarah worked with older students on more advanced texts. The children were bright and eager despite the obvious signs that many came from struggling families, patched clothing, worn shoes. The hungry way, some devoured the simple lunch Sarah provided. When the school day ended, Charlotte helped Sarah tidy the room, impressed by the younger woman's dedication and resourcefulness. "You've created something remarkable here," Charlotte observed as they shelved the last of the books. Sarah shrugged, though her eyes betrayed her pride. "It's not much compared to proper schools back east, but it's what these children have. For many, especially those from the Apache settlement, it's their only chance at learning to read and write English. The town doesn't support you." "Some do," Sarah replied, wiping down the blackboard. "Reverend Whitaker donates books despite disagreeing with my teaching methods. Dr. Miller sometimes gives lectures on basic anatomy and hygiene, but the town council—" She shook her head. "They see little value in educating children they consider beneath notice." "And Gabriel Mr. Sterling helps you?" Charlotte asked, remembering his earlier comment. Sarah nodded. "He provides funding for supplies and contributes to my small salary. Not many here would associate themselves with such a controversial endeavor, but your husband has never seemed concerned with popular opinion." "No," Charlotte agreed, finding herself smiling slightly. "He certainly hasn't." They sat together on the schoolhouse steps, watching as the last of the children disappeared down the paths leading to town or to the scattered homesteads beyond. "May I ask you something personal, Mrs. Sterling?" Sarah ventured after a comfortable silence. "Charlotte, please. And yes, you may. Your marriage to Mr. Sterling, it was quite sudden." Sarah's direct gaze held no judgment, only honest curiosity. "The town gossips have their theories, of course, but I wondered about the truth." Charlotte hesitated, uncertain how much to share. Something about Sarah inspired trust, yet the full story of her arrangement with Gabriel was too private and potentially damaging to disclose completely. "My first husband left significant debts when he died," she finally said. "Mr. Sterling knew him during the war and felt a certain obligation to help. Our marriage was a practical solution to a difficult situation." Sarah nodded slowly. "I suspected it might be something of that nature. Marriages of convenience aren't uncommon in the territory." She smiled. "Though I'll admit Gabriel Sterling seemed the last man likely to enter into such an arrangement. He's kept to himself since his wife and daughter passed." "You knew them, Marie and Emma." Charlotte couldn't disguise her interest. "Marie taught me for a time before she established this school," Sarah explained. "She was remarkable, brilliant, determined, compassionate. The daughter of a Cheyenne chief, educated in the East, but never forgetting her heritage." Her expression grew wistful. "Emma was just 4 when the fever took them both. A beautiful child, with her mother's spirit and her father's quiet intensity. Charlotte felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Not jealousy exactly, but a sharp awareness of the ghosts that still inhabited Sterling Ridge and Gabriel's heart. "He doesn't speak of them," she said quietly. "No, he wouldn't," Sarah agreed. Marie used to say he kept his feelings locked away like treasure too precious to risk in casual exchange. She gave Charlotte a considering look. "But that doesn't mean they aren't there." The conversation left Charlotte with much to contemplate as she rode back to Sterling Ridge. She found herself looking at the ranch with new eyes, not just as a property she now inhabited, but as the home Gabriel had built with Marie, filled with Emma's laughter, before tragedy transformed it into the silent, orderly place it was now. For the first time, Charlotte wondered if she was more than just an obligation to Gabriel, if perhaps she represented something else, the possibility, however remote, of healing. The thought was unsettling in its implications. Their marriage was a business arrangement, she reminded herself firmly. Any other feelings would only complicate an already complex situation. Yet, as she approached the main house, seeing Gabriel on the porch awaiting her return, Charlotte couldn't quite suppress the warmth that bloomed in her chest at the sight of him, or the nagging question of whether such feelings were truly unwelcome. The discovery of Marie's journal was accidental. Charlotte had been searching the attic for additional blankets as the nights remained surprisingly cool, even as summer approached. In a cedar chest, tucked beneath the eaves beneath neatly folded quilts, her hands encountered a small leather-bound book. She would have replaced it without looking, respecting the privacy of the house and its history, had a loose page not fallen from between the covers. Charlotte picked it up and couldn't help reading the elegant script that filled the page. April 3, 1871. Gabriel remains unconvinced of my suspicions regarding HT's business dealings. He says I imagine conspiracy where there is merely ambition. Perhaps he is right. Yet I cannot dismiss what I have seen, the changed water, the mysterious illness of cattle at the Peterson place, after they refused to sell the same pattern at the Miller Ranch. Too many coincidences for my comfort. I will continue my observations discreetly. The initials HT, besieged, immediately captured Charlotte's attention. Harrison Thorne had been in Redemption Valley that long, and what were these business dealings that had concerned Marie curiosity overcoming propriety? Charlotte opened the journal and began to read from the beginning. Marie's voice emerged from the pages, intelligent, observant, passionate about her adopted home and the man she had married. The early entries detailed her efforts to win acceptance in a community suspicious of her native heritage, her joy in motherhood, her plans for the school that Sarah now ran. But as Charlotte continued reading, a darker thread emerged. Marie had noticed patterns in the territory ranchers who refused to sell land to Thorne's development company, subsequently experiencing mysterious misfortunes, contaminated wells, sick livestock, damaged equipment. Nothing that could be definitively traced to Thorne, but suspicious nonetheless. May 10th. Tested the water from our south well today while G was in town. The results confirm my fears: traces of arsenic, not enough to kill quickly, but sufficient to cause illness over time. Someone has been tampering with our water supply. I will tell G tonight. We must be vigilant. The entries stopped abruptly after that. The final page, dated May 15, 1871, contained only a brief note. Strange illness affecting Emma. Fever, stomach distress. Dr. Miller says it's passing through town. I am not convinced. My own throat burns when I drink our water. G thinks I'm being fanciful, but has agreed to use only the north well until tests can be conducted. Must send samples to the laboratory in Tucson. Charlotte closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. Marie and Emma had died of fever shortly after this entry, a fever that had swept through parts of Redemption Valley but had been particularly severe at Sterling Ridge.
Could it be possible? Had Thorne actually poisoned the water to force Gabriel to sell the ranch? The idea seemed monstrous, yet it aligned with the discrepancies Charlotte had found in the ledgers, a systematic campaign to weaken Sterling Ridge through small, persistent attacks. The question now was whether to share this discovery with Gabriel. The journal contained Marie's suspicions, not proof. And if Gabriel had dismissed his wife's concerns, then would he believe them now, coming from Charlotte? Moreover, if Marie was right, if Thorne was responsible for the deaths of Gabriel's family, what would that knowledge do to him? Charlotte carefully returned the journal to the chest, keeping only the loose page as evidence. She needed more information before approaching Gabriel with such explosive suspicions. She needed to understand the full scope of Thorne's operations and ambitions in Redemption Valley. The opportunity to gather such information presented itself sooner than expected. The following afternoon, as Charlotte was returning from another visit to Sarah's school, she encountered a stranger on the road to Sterling Ridge, a man whose horse had gone lame about a mile from the ranch. "Ma'am," he called as she approached, tipping his hat politely, "might I trouble you for directions to the nearest place I could rest my horse? She's taken a stone bruise, I think." Charlotte reined Willow to a stop, maintaining a cautious distance. The man appeared to be in his late 30s with a weather-beaten face and the alert eyes of someone accustomed to watching his surroundings. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, partially hidden by a neatly trimmed beard. "Sterling Ridge Ranch is just ahead," she replied. "I'm Mrs. Sterling. My husband would be happy to provide assistance for your horse." Relief crossed the man's features. "Much obliged, Mrs. Sterling. Name's Jackson Reed. I've been on the trail for 3 days from Tucson, and this poor girl picked the worst time to come up lame." He patted his horse's neck affectionately. Something about Reed's manner, direct but respectful, with none of the oily charm Thorne's men typically displayed, put Charlotte at ease. "Follow me, Mr. Reed. Our foreman Daniel is excellent with horses." When they reached the ranch, Gabriel was in the corral working with a young stallion. He looked up at their approach, his expression shifting from concentration to wariness, as he noticed the stranger accompanying Charlotte. "Mr. Sterling?" Charlotte called. "This is Mr. Reed. His horse has taken a stone bruise on the road." Gabriel approached his gaze, assessing the newcomer. "Reed," he acknowledged with a nod, "let's have a look at your mare." Daniel was summoned, and after examining the horse confirmed that she would need at least 2 days' rest before continuing any journey. Gabriel offered Reed the hospitality of Sterling Ridge with a reluctance that was subtle but clear to Charlotte. "I don't want to impose," Reed said, seeming to sense Gabriel's reservation, "but I'd be grateful for a place to bunk tonight. I'm heading to Redemption Valley on business." "What kind of business?" Gabriel asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Reed hesitated, glancing at Charlotte. Gabriel nodded slightly, indicating she was privy to ranch matters. "I've been tracking some information about Harrison Thorne," Reed said finally, "specifically his activities before he established himself in Redemption Valley." The name Thorne immediately changed the atmosphere. Gabriel's posture stiffened, and Charlotte felt her heart rate increase. "What's your interest in Thorne?" Gabriel asked, his voice cooler than before. Reed's hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his face. "Let's just say we have unfinished business. I served time in Yuma Territorial Prison with his brother, Albert Thorne. Learned some things that might interest certain parties." Gabriel and Charlotte exchanged a look. This was unexpected information. Charlotte hadn't even known Thorne had a brother, let alone one who had been imprisoned. "You're welcome to stay the night," Gabriel decided. "We'll discuss this further over supper." That evening, after Martha had served a simple but hearty meal,
and retired to her quarters, Reed shared his story. He had been a Confederate soldier captured late in the war and imprisoned until 1866. After his release, he had drifted west, eventually running afoul of the law in Tucson over a bar fight that turned deadly. "I'm not proud of my past," Reed admitted, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Did my 5 years in Yuma fair and square. That's where I met Albert Thorne Harrison's younger brother and former business partner." "I wasn't aware Thorne had a partner," Gabriel said. "He arrived in Redemption Valley about 10 years ago, already wealthy from gold investments, according to local accounts." Reed's smile was grim. "That's the story he tells. The truth is somewhat darker. Albert was sentenced to hang for the murder of their original partner, James Whitfield. They'd struck a rich vein near Prescott, and suddenly Whitfield turned up dead in a mineshaft accident, according to Harrison. But Albert was the one charged when evidence surfaced." "What evidence?" Charlotte asked, unable to contain her curiosity. "A witness who saw Albert near the mine that night, blood on his clothes. A letter from Harrison instructing Albert to handle the Whitfield problem." Reed shook his head. "Albert maintained his innocence until the end, claimed Harrison had set him up to take the fall. No one believed him. Why would a successful man like Harrison Thorne need to kill for gold when he already had plenty?" Gabriel leaned forward, his interest evident despite his controlled expression. "And you believe Albert's version?" "I do," Reed confirmed, "because on the night before his hanging, Albert told me something he'd never told anyone else, where to find proof that Harrison had orchestrated the whole thing. A sworn affidavit from one of their workers who witnessed Harrison paying off the man who actually killed Whitfield." "Where is this affidavit?" Gabriel asked. Reed's expression darkened. "That's the problem. Albert said he gave it to a prospector named Hayes for safekeeping a man who'd done some work for them and had no love for Harrison." He looked at Charlotte. "You wouldn't happen to be related to a William Hayes, would you?" The name hit Charlotte like a physical blow. "He was my father-in-law," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jonathan's father. He died about 5 years ago, prospecting in the Bradshaw Mountains." Reed nodded slowly. "That explains a few things. After I got out of Yuma, I started looking into Albert's claims, tracked down rumors about this affidavit, which led me eventually to Redemption Valley. When I started asking questions, I heard about a widow named Hayes, whose husband had recently died under suspicious circumstances." "Jonathan took his own life," Charlotte said automatically, the words bitter in her mouth. "He had difficulties after the war. Debts." "Did he?" Reed's gaze was sympathetic but questioning. "Or is that what everyone was led to believe?" Gabriel's hand came down hard on the table. "That's enough speculation for tonight. You're suggesting Thorne had Jonathan Hayes killed because he might have known about this affidavit." "I'm suggesting it's possible," Reed replied evenly. "Thorne has built an empire on eliminating obstacles. If he thought Jonathan Hayes possessed evidence that could destroy him, he wouldn't hesitate." Charlotte felt the room spin slightly. Could it be true? Had Jonathan's death, which she had mourned as the tragic culmination of his post-war struggles, actually been murder? "I need air," she said abruptly, rising from the table. Gabriel stood as well. "We'll continue this discussion tomorrow, Reed. Daniel will show you to the bunkhouse." Outside on the porch, Charlotte gulped the cool night air, trying to steady herself. Gabriel joined her a moment later, maintaining a respectful distance. "Are you all right?" he asked after a moment. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Everything I thought I understood about Jonathan's death. To think it might have been—" She couldn't complete the sentence. Reed's theory is just that, a theory, Gabriel said gently. Without proof, it's speculation. Charlotte turned to face him. But it aligns with what I found in Marie's journal. Gabriel went very still. What? Realizing what she had revealed, Charlotte hesitated, then decided that complete honesty was necessary. I found Marie's journal in the attic. She suspected Thorne was poisoning water sources at ranches that wouldn't sell to him, including Sterling Ridge. Her last entry was about Emma getting sick and her concerns about your water. The color drained from Gabriel's face. In the moonlight, he looked almost ghostly. You read her private thoughts. I didn't intend to pry, Charlotte said, feeling defensive despite her guilt. A page fell out, and I saw Thorne's initials. Given what we'd already discovered in the ledgers, I thought it might be important. Gabriel's jaw tightened visibly. So you decided to invade my wife's privacy rather than bring your concerns to me directly. I wasn't sure you'd believe me, Charlotte admitted. Marie wrote that you dismissed her suspicions at the time. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. If Gabriel had believed Marie, if he had acted on her concerns, might she and Emma still be alive? Where is this journal? Gabriel asked, his voice dangerously controlled. In the cedar chest in the attic, where I found it, Charlotte replied. I took only one loose page as evidence in case... In case what? Gabriel interrupted. In case you needed to convince me that I failed to protect my family, that I ignored warnings that might have saved them. His voice rose with each word, raw emotion finally breaking through his composed exterior. No, Charlotte protested. That wasn't my intent at all. I just wanted to understand what was happening before I approached you with such painful possibilities. Gabriel turned away, his hands gripping the porch railing so tightly his knuckles showed white. Bring me the page. And in the future, Mrs. Sterling, remember that our arrangement does not grant you unlimited access to my past or my privacy. The formal address stung more than Charlotte expected. They had been making progress, moving tentatively towards something that felt like partnership, perhaps even friendship. Now she had shattered that fragile connection with her well-intentioned but clumsy investigation. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'll get the page for you. As she turned to enter the house, Gabriel's voice stopped her. Charlotte. She looked back, surprised by his use of her given name. If what you and Reed suggest is true, if Thorne is responsible for the deaths of my family and your husband, there will be a reckoning. His eyes, when they met hers, contained a cold fury that sent a shiver down her spine. And I will not rest until justice is served, whatever the cost. In that moment, Charlotte glimpsed the soldier Gabriel had once been, the officer who had led men into battle, who had faced death and dealt it in return. It was both frightening and oddly reassuring to know that such strength lay beneath his controlled exterior. Nor will I, she replied, her own resolve hardening. If Thorne killed Jonathan, if he orphaned Emma and widowed both of us, then he will answer for it. Something shifted in Gabriel's expression, a recognition, perhaps, that despite their unconventional beginning, they now shared a common purpose more binding than any marriage certificate. Get some rest, he said, his tone softening slightly. Tomorrow we begin planning our next steps. This must be handled carefully. Thorne has allies throughout the territory. Charlotte nodded and entered the house, leaving Gabriel alone with the night and the ghosts that Reed's revelations had awakened. Their marriage of convenience had just become something far more complicated, an alliance against a common enemy forged in shared grief and the promise of retribution. As she prepared for bed, Charlotte found herself wondering if such a foundation could sustain something lasting, or if it too would crumble once justice was served, and their original arrangement reached its natural conclusion. The question followed her into uneasy dreams, where Jonathan and Marie stood side by side, their faces somber, as they watched their surviving spouses navigate a path neither had anticipated. The following week brought dramatic changes to Sterling Ridge. Gabriel, energized by the possibility of finally understanding what had happened to Marie and Emma, threw himself into investigation with military precision. He dispatched trusted ranch hands to make discreet inquiries in neighboring towns about Thorne's business activities and prior associates. Meanwhile, Charlotte methodically reviewed every piece of correspondence and documentation from the period leading up to Marie and Emma's deaths, searching for any corroborating evidence of water contamination. She also began compiling a detailed account of Jonathan's final months, looking for signs she might have missed: unusual meetings, unexpected visitors, changes in his behavior beyond what she had attributed to his war trauma. Reed remained at Sterling Ridge, his knowledge of Thorne's past proving invaluable. He identified several former associates of the Thorne brothers who might have information about the alleged affidavit, and Gabriel arranged for messages to be sent to each. "The key," Reed explained as they gathered in Gabriel's study one evening, "is finding the affidavit William Hayes supposedly had. Without it, we have suspicions, but no proof." Jonathan never mentioned any documents from his father, Charlotte said, frustration evident in her voice. If William entrusted him with something so important, why keep it secret, even from me? Protection, perhaps, Gabriel suggested. If he knew how dangerous the information was, he might have thought ignorance would keep you safe. The idea was both touching and infuriating. How like Jonathan to try to shield her even as he crumbled under the weight of his own burdens. "We need to search your old cabin," Gabriel decided. "If the affidavit exists, it's likely hidden there. Jonathan would have kept it close." Charlotte nodded, though the thought of returning to the place where she had found Jonathan's body filled her with dread. "When?" "Tonight," Gabriel replied. "Under cover of darkness. Thorne's men have been watching the property, but they're less vigilant after midnight." The plan was simple. Gabriel, Charlotte, and Reed would ride to the Hayes cabin after the town had settled for the night. Daniel and two trusted hands would create a distraction at the far end of Redemption Valley to draw away any of Thorne's watchers, allowing the trio to search the cabin undisturbed. As dusk fell, Charlotte changed into practical clothing trousers borrowed from one of the younger ranch hands, a dark shirt and a jacket, several sizes too large, that effectively disguised her feminine silhouette. She braided her hair tightly and tucked it under a wide-brimmed hat, completing the transformation. When she emerged from her room, Gabriel was waiting in the hallway. His eyes widened slightly at her appearance. "Will I pass for one of your hands in the dark?" she asked, oddly self-conscious under his scrutiny. "From a distance," he replied, "though I've never had a ranch hand with such delicate features." Was that almost a compliment? Charlotte couldn't be sure, and Gabriel's expression gave nothing away as he turned toward the stairs. "Reed is waiting with the horses. We should move out." The ride to Redemption Valley was tense and silent. They took a roundabout route to avoid the main road, adding nearly an hour to the journey, but reducing the risk of detection. The moon, just past full, provided enough light to navigate, but also cast deep shadows where anyone might be hiding. Charlotte felt her anxiety mounting as they approached the outskirts of town. She had not returned to the cabin since the day after Jonathan's funeral, when she had collected a few personal belongings before moving to a small rented room in town. The thought of seeing it again, the place where her husband had ended his life, sent cold waves of dread through her body. As if sensing her distress, Gabriel guided his horse closer to hers. "We'll be quick," he said quietly. "In and out. You don't have to enter if it's too difficult." She appreciated the consideration but shook her head. "I need to do this. If there's something hidden there that Jonathan knew about, I might recognize where to look." The Hayes cabin stood in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the edge of town, partially obscured by cottonwood trees. It was a modest structure built by William Hayes during the early days of Redemption Valley's settlement, and expanded slightly when Jonathan brought his Boston bride west after the war. As they approached, Reed signaled for them to halt in the shelter of the trees. "Something's not right," he whispered. "There's a light." Charlotte peered through the darkness and saw it too, the faint glow of a lantern visible through the cabin's single window. Someone was inside. Gabriel dismounted silently, motioning for Charlotte and Reed to remain with the horses. He moved toward the cabin with the stealth of a man accustomed to reconnoitering enemy positions, keeping to the shadows until he reached the window. After a moment's observation, he returned to where Charlotte and Reed waited anxiously. "Two men," he reported in a low voice, "tearing the place apart, looking for something." "Thorne's men?" Reed asked. Gabriel nodded grimly. "Finch and another I don't recognize. They've already pulled up floorboards and are checking the walls for hidden compartments." Charlotte's heart sank. "They're looking for the affidavit. They must know or suspect it's there." "This changes things," Gabriel said, his mind clearly working through alternatives. "We can't risk a confrontation here so close to town. Any gunfire would bring unwanted attention." "So we wait them out," Reed suggested. Gabriel considered this, then shook his head. "No, they might find what we're looking for. We need a different approach." He turned to Charlotte. "Is there anything in that cabin that only you would know about, a hiding place Jonathan might have used that wouldn't be obvious to strangers?" Charlotte closed her eyes, trying to visualize the cabin's interior. It had been over 2 years, and the memories were painful, clouded by grief. "There was a loose stone in the hearth," she said finally, "behind the iron pot hook. Jonathan used to hide small amounts of money there when he was concerned about thieves." "Too obvious," Gabriel determined. "They'll check that." "What about—" Charlotte hesitated, then continued more confidently. "Jonathan's father was religious. He had an old family Bible that Jonathan kept after his death. It was important to him, even though he wasn't particularly devout himself." Gabriel's expression sharpened with interest. "Where did he keep it?" "On a shelf above our bed. But it wouldn't be obvious as a hiding place. It was just one book among several." "Unless you knew to look there specifically," Gabriel mused. "It has potential. Biblical references were common coded messages during the war." A plan quickly formed. Reed would circle around to the back of the cabin and create a distraction, a thrown rock, an animal noise, anything to draw the men outside briefly. While they investigated, Gabriel would enter through the front door and retrieve the Bible. Charlotte would remain with the horses, ready for a quick departure. "If anything goes wrong," Gabriel instructed her, "ride back to Sterling Ridge as fast as possible. Don't wait for us. Don't try to help. Get to Daniel and tell him what happened." Charlotte wanted to protest, but recognized the wisdom in his instructions. She was not trained for combat, and her presence could be a liability if the situation turned violent. Reed disappeared into the darkness, moving silently through the underbrush toward the rear of the cabin. Gabriel positioned himself near the front door, hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Charlotte held the horse's reins, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give away their position. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Then, from somewhere behind the cabin came the distinctive cry of a wildcat, so convincing that Charlotte momentarily believed an actual mountain lion was nearby. The sound was followed by a crash as if something had been knocked over. The effect was immediate. The cabin door flew open, and Finch emerged, gun drawn, followed by his companion. They moved cautiously toward the source of the disturbance, disappearing around the side of the building. Gabriel wasted no time. He slipped through the open door, and Charlotte held her breath, counting the seconds. 20. 30. How long would Reed's distraction hold the men's attention? A shout from behind the cabin suggested the answer: not long enough. Gabriel emerged from the door at a run, something clutched under his arm, just as a gunshot shattered the night silence. "Go!" he yelled to Charlotte, leaping onto his horse with fluid grace. "Ride!" Reed appeared from the darkness, running in a crouch as more shots rang out behind him. He swung onto his horse in a single motion, and the three of them galloped away from the cabin, heading not toward town or Sterling Ridge, but east toward the open country beyond Redemption Valley. They rode hard for nearly a mile before Gabriel signaled a halt in a dense copse of trees. They dismounted, the horses' labored breathing loud in the sudden quiet. "Did you find it?" Charlotte asked anxiously. Gabriel nodded, holding up an old leather-bound Bible. "This is it." "Yes," Charlotte confirmed, reaching for it with trembling hands. The Bible was heavier than she remembered, its leather cover cracked with age and use. William Hayes's name was embossed on the front, the gold lettering nearly worn away. Charlotte opened it carefully, paging through the familiar text, looking for anything unusual. "There's nothing here," she said after examining several sections. "No loose papers, no markings." "Check the binding," Reed suggested. "Old trick slicing open the spine to hide documents." Gabriel took the Bible back, running his fingers along the spine. "There's something," he confirmed. "I can feel a separation in the leather." Using his pocket knife, he carefully slit the binding along an almost invisible seam. From within the hollowed spine, he extracted a folded document, yellow with age, but still intact. Charlotte held the lantern closer as Gabriel unfolded the paper. It was indeed an affidavit signed by one Alistair Finch. "Any relation to our friend back there?" Reed wondered aloud, and witnessed by William Hayes. The document detailed how Harrison Thorne had paid Finch $500 to cause a fatal accident for James Whitfield, then framed his own brother Albert for the murder when Finch demanded more money. William Hayes had apparently been working a nearby claim and witnessed the transaction, though he had not understood its significance until later reports of Whitfield's death. This is it," Gabriel said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Proof that Thorne's fortune was built on murder. With this, we could bring him down." "It's not enough," Charlotte said, surprising herself with the words. "This proves he killed his partner years ago, but not that he was responsible for what happened to Marie and Emma, or to Jonathan." Gabriel's expression hardened. "It establishes a pattern. Shows he's capable of murder for financial gain. The rest we can piece together." "But will it be enough for the law?" Charlotte pressed. "For a territorial judge," Reed interjected. "She's right. We need more specifically evidence linking Thorne to the poisonings Marie suspected and to Jonathan's death. Otherwise, Thorne will claim this is an old, isolated incident, possibly even a forgery." Gabriel carefully refolded the affidavit and tucked it inside his shirt. "Then we continue gathering evidence. This is just the beginning." He looked at Charlotte, a new respect in his gaze. "You were right about the Bible. Jonathan did keep it close." The validation should have pleased her, but Charlotte found herself dwelling on a different aspect of the night's revelations. "Thorne's men were searching the cabin," she said slowly. "They knew, or at least suspected, that the affidavit existed and might be hidden there. Why now, after all this time? Maybe because of our marriage," Gabriel suggested. "Thorne might have worried that I would eventually learn about the document through you." "Or because of my inquiries," Reed added. "I haven't exactly been subtle in my investigation." "Either way," Gabriel concluded, We've confirmed that Thorne still considers this affidavit a threat, which means it has value. Now we need to build on it, find more evidence, particularly about the water contamination. They mounted their horses again this time, heading directly for Sterling Ridge. The night's excitement had forged a new bond between them, a shared purpose that transcended their original arrangement. As they rode side by side, Charlotte found herself stealing glances at Gabriel, seeing him in a new light. He had risked his life tonight to recover a document that might bring justice not only for his wife and daughter, but also for her husband. In doing so, he had demonstrated a depth of commitment that went beyond duty or obligation. For the first time since their unusual marriage began, Charlotte allowed herself to consider that perhaps their partnership might evolve into something neither of them had anticipated. Something genuine and lasting, built not on convenience, but on mutual respect and shared purpose. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, for it meant opening herself to the possibility of loss once again. Yet, as Sterling Ridge appeared on the horizon outlined against the pre-dawn sky, Charlotte realized that some risks were worth taking, and some bonds once formed could not easily be broken. The days following their nighttime expedition were filled with renewed purpose. Gabriel sent trusted men to Tucson and Prescott with letters to contacts who might provide additional information about Thorne's activities. Meanwhile, Charlotte and Reed carefully compiled all available evidence, creating a timeline that connected the various suspicious events. A breakthrough came unexpectedly through Sarah Nighthawk. Charlotte had continued her visits to the school, finding both purpose and respite in working with the children. During one such visit, she mentioned their investigation to Sarah, careful to keep the details vague. "We're trying to understand certain patterns of illness around the valley over the past few years," Charlotte explained as they walked along the creek after school hours, "specifically cases that might be connected to water contamination." Sarah stopped walking, her expression suddenly serious. "You're investigating Thorne, aren't you?" Charlotte hesitated, then nodded. There was no point denying it to someone as perceptive as Sarah. "My people have been watching him for years," Sarah said quietly. "The Apache don't forget when their children sicken and die from tainted water, or when their land is stolen through deception." "You have evidence?" Charlotte asked, hope rising in her chest. "Not the kind that would convince a white man's court," Sarah replied. "But yes, we have knowledge, observations. My uncle, who knows the old ways of healing, has collected samples from streams and wells where livestock and people fell ill. He found a pattern properties that refused to sell to Thorne's company, often experienced water problems shortly afterward." "Would your uncle speak with us?" Charlotte asked eagerly. "His observations combined with Marie's journal and the other evidence we've gathered could strengthen our case significantly." Sarah considered this. "He is wary of white authorities with good reason, but I believe he would speak with you and Mr. Sterling. He respected Marie greatly." They arranged for Sarah's uncle, a man named Thomas Nighthawk, to visit Sterling Ridge the following evening. Charlotte rode home with renewed hope, eager to share this development with Gabriel. She found him in the barn examining the hooves of a mare that had been limping. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of physical labor. A streak of dirt marked his cheek, where he had absently wiped his face with a dusty hand. Charlotte paused in the doorway, struck by the dichotomy of the man before her, the educated former officer who quoted Shakespeare in unguarded moments, yet was equally at home with the practical demands of ranch life. In the weeks since their marriage, she had come to appreciate both aspects of his character. "You're staring, Mrs. Sterling," Gabriel observed without looking up from the horse's hoof. Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed at being caught. "I have news," she said, changing the subject. Sarah Nighthawk's uncle, has been collecting evidence of water contamination throughout the valley. He's willing to meet with us tomorrow evening. Now Gabriel did look up, his interest evident. That could be significant. The Apache are careful observers. If he's been tracking patterns of illness. Exactly what I thought, Charlotte agreed, stepping fully into the barn. Combined with Marie's journal and the affidavit, it strengthens our case considerably. Gabriel gently set down the mare's hoof and straightened. You've done well, he said, a simple statement that nonetheless warmed Charlotte from within. We're making progress, she acknowledged, but I still wonder why Thorne seems so focused on Sterling Ridge. There are other properties closer to town more convenient for whatever he's planning. Gabriel wiped his hands on a rag, his expression thoughtful. I've been considering that as well. The location is strategic. We control a significant water source and the best grazing land in the valley. But there might be more to it. Such as revenge, Gabriel said simply. I refused to sell when Thorne first arrived in Redemption Valley. Later, I publicly opposed his appointment to the Territorial Banking Commission. Small wounds to his pride, perhaps, but men like Thorne have long memories for slights. Charlotte nodded slowly. And he seems particularly vindictive toward those who refuse to bend to his will. Precisely. Gabriel hung the rag on a hook and moved toward the barn door. With Thomas Nighthawk's evidence, we might finally have enough to approach the territorial marshal. As they walked together toward the house, Charlotte was acutely aware of Gabriel's presence beside her, the subtle scent of leather and horse, and clean sweat, the measured cadence of his stride, the way his hand occasionally brushed against hers as if by accident. These small, seemingly insignificant details had become increasingly important to her over the past weeks. She found herself noticing things about Gabriel she had previously overlooked, the rare moments when he almost smiled, the gentleness in his hands, despite their strength, the way his voice softened when he spoke of Marie and Emma, not with the raw grief of fresh loss, but with a quieter, more reflective sadness. They had begun taking supper together in the evenings initially to discuss the investigation, but gradually expanding to other topics, books they had read, places they had seen, the changing politics of the territory. Charlotte discovered that Gabriel possessed a dry wit that emerged unexpectedly in his observations, while he seemed to appreciate her more direct humor. These developments both pleased and alarmed Charlotte. Their marriage remained a practical arrangement with clear boundaries, yet those boundaries seemed increasingly fluid. She told herself that their growing companionship was natural, given their shared purpose and proximity. Nothing more. Yet sometimes, in unguarded moments like this, walking side by side in the golden light of late afternoon, Charlotte allowed herself to wonder what might happen when their investigation concluded, when justice was served, and the original purpose of their marriage no longer existed. Would Gabriel expect her to leave to make her own way with the settlement he had promised? Or might he, like her, be contemplating the possibility of transforming their arrangement into something genuine? Such thoughts were dangerous, Charlotte knew. Better to focus on the task at hand, gathering evidence, building their case against Thorne. The future would unfold in its own time, revealing possibilities neither of them could yet envision. For now it was enough to walk beside him toward the house they shared, united in purpose, if uncertain in destination. Thomas Nighthawk arrived at Sterling Ridge as dusk painted the western sky in hues of amber and gold. He was older than Charlotte had expected, perhaps 70, with deeply lined features and silver hair worn in 2 long braids. Despite his age, he sat straight in the saddle, his eyes alert and watchful as Gabriel greeted him at the front gate. Sarah accompanied her uncle, serving as both guide and translator, though Thomas's English proved better than Charlotte had anticipated. They gathered in Gabriel's study, where Reed had arranged the evidence they'd collected thus far, Marie's journal, the affidavit from the Bible, and ledgers showing the suspicious financial discrepancies. Thomas listened silently as Gabriel explained their investigation, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Gabriel finished, the older man removed a small leather pouch from inside his jacket and carefully opened it on the desk. "For 5 summers I have collected these," he said, his voice deep and measured. "From streams, from wells, from places where the land speaks of poison." Inside the pouch were small glass vials, each containing soil or sediment samples meticulously labeled with locations and dates. Thomas pointed to one marked with a crude drawing of a ridge, Sterling Ridge. "This from your south well, the summer the sickness came," he explained. "Your wife, she asked me to look. She knew something was wrong with the water." Gabriel's hand hovered over the vial, not quite touching it. "Marie consulted you." His voice held surprise and a hint of hurt, perhaps, at the realization that his wife had sought outside help when he had dismissed her concerns. Thomas nodded. "She was wise woman, listened to the land." He indicated another vial. "This from Peterson Ranch before they sell to Thorne. Many cattle die strange sickness. Same at Miller Place at White Tree Canyon." As Sarah opened a small notebook she had brought, "My uncle has documented 17 separate incidents over the past 8 years," she explained. "In 15 cases, the property owners sold to Thorne's company within months of experiencing water problems or livestock deaths." "And the other 2?" Charlotte asked. "Sterling Ridge," Sarah replied. "And the Apache settlement lands which cannot be sold without federal approval." The pattern was unmistakable. Properties that refused Thorne's offers experienced mysterious troubles until they capitulated, or in the case of Sterling Ridge, suffered tragedy. "Can these samples prove poisoning?" Gabriel asked, a new intensity in his voice. Thomas shook his head. "Not to white man's court. Too much time passed. But pattern is clear to those with eyes to see." Reed, who had been examining the samples, looked up thoughtfully. "What we need is fresh evidence proof that Thorne is still employing these methods." "Or a confession," Charlotte added. "Something that would corroborate what these patterns suggest." Gabriel's expression hardened with resolve. "I've been considering a more direct approach, confronting Thorne with what we know, forcing his hand." "That would be dangerous," Charlotte protested. "Thorne has allies throughout the territory, including the sheriff." "Not to mention his hired guns," Reed added. "Finch isn't the type to ask questions before shooting." Thomas Nighthawk, who had been quietly observing their discussion, spoke again. "Man like Thorne he not confess, but his secrets they speak if you know where to listen." He turned to Sarah. "Tell them of the papers." Sarah hesitated, glancing at her uncle before continuing. "One of the children at my school, Luis Martinez, his father works as a clerk in Thorne's office. Recently, he overheard Thorne discussing plans for a major land acquisition ahead of a railroad expansion." Gabriel leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What railroad expansion?" "The Southern Pacific is planning a spur line through Redemption Valley," Sarah explained. "It's not public knowledge yet, but Thorne has connections in Sacramento. He's been quietly buying properties along the proposed route at prices well below what they'll be worth once the railroad arrives." The implications were staggering. A railroad connection would transform Redemption Valley from a remote settlement into a crucial transportation hub, multiplying land values overnight. Those who controlled property along the route would become wealthy beyond measure. "That explains his persistent interest in Sterling Ridge," Gabriel said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The most direct route from the main line would cross the southern portion of our grazing lands." Charlotte felt pieces clicking into place. "And Jonathan's property, it borders the eastern edge of the valley, doesn't it? Another likely path for the tracks." Reed whistled low. No wonder Thorne was willing to kill for those parcels. We're not talking about ranching or mining claims anymore. We're talking about the future of the entire territory. Thomas nodded gravely. Man who controls the iron road controls everything. Water, cattle, people all must follow where the tracks lead. As the full scope of Thorne's ambitions became clear, a somber silence fell over the room. They were no longer merely seeking justice for past crimes. They were standing in the way of a ruthless man's vision for the future. A vision worth millions. We need to see those railroad plans, Gabriel decided. If we can prove Thorne has been using insider information to acquire land fraudulently, combined with the evidence of his other crimes, we'd have enough to approach the territorial governor directly, bypassing local authorities. Martinez might be persuaded to help us, Sarah suggested. He fears Thorne, but he cares deeply for his son's future. It's too risky, Charlotte countered. If Thorne suspected Martinez was working against him, the man's life wouldn't be worth a Confederate dollar. Gabriel considered this, then turned to Reed. What about you? Could you pose as a potential investor approach Thorne directly? Reed stroked his beard thoughtfully. Possibly, though he might recognize me from my inquiries about Albert. He smiled grimly. And this scar isn't exactly forgettable. As they debated approaches, Charlotte found her gaze drawn to the map of Redemption Valley that hung on Gabriel's study wall. Something about the geography nagged at her a detail just beyond her grasp. The railroad would need water access, she said, suddenly interrupting the men's discussion, for the steam engines. Gabriel followed her gaze to the map. The creek that runs through Sterling Ridge is the most reliable water source in the valley, especially since Thorne has been contaminating other sources, Charlotte finished, the realization chilling her. He's been systematically eliminating competition for the railroad contract. Our water rights are probably more valuable than the land itself. The pieces continued falling into place, creating a picture more sinister than any of them had imagined. Thorne wasn't just a greedy businessman or even an opportunistic murderer. He was orchestrating a complete takeover of Redemption Valley, eliminating anyone who stood in his way. We need to move quickly, Gabriel decided, before Thorne realizes how much we know. They formulated a plan. Reed would travel to Tucson, where he had contacts in the territorial government who might provide official information about the railroad expansion. Sarah would approach Martinez cautiously, seeing if he might be willing to provide documentation of Thorne's activities. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Charlotte would continue compiling and organizing their evidence. As the meeting concluded, Thomas Nighthawk placed a weathered hand on Gabriel's arm. "Be careful, Sterling. Coyote most dangerous when cornered." The old man's warning lingered in the air long after he and Sarah had departed. Charlotte found herself unable to sleep that night, her mind racing with possibilities and dangers. She stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape of Sterling Ridge, now understanding why Thorne coveted it so desperately and why he might take extreme measures to acquire it. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Gabriel stood in the hallway, similarly sleepless, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "I apologize for the late hour," he said, his voice low. "But I've been reviewing Marie's journal again, and I found something I think you should see." Charlotte ushered him in, lighting an additional lamp. Propriety would normally forbid a man's presence in her bedroom at this hour, but their unusual marriage and the urgency of their investigation had rendered conventional boundaries increasingly irrelevant. Gabriel opened the portfolio on the small table by the window, revealing several pages of Marie's elegant handwriting that Charlotte hadn't seen before. "These were separated from the main journal," he explained. "I kept them elsewhere." Charlotte understood immediately. These pages had been too personal, too painful for him to include with the others.
The fact that he was sharing them now represented a significant shift in their relationship. Marie was mapping the pattern of illness across the valley. Gabriel continued, indicating diagrams Marie had drawn, showing property boundaries and water sources. She was more thorough than I realized. Charlotte studied the pages, impressed by Marie's methodical approach. She suspected Thorne long before anyone else did. Yes, Gabriel's voice held a complex mixture of pride and regret. She was trying to protect our home, our daughter, while He trailed off, the unspoken self-recrimination hanging in the air between them. Without thinking, Charlotte placed her hand on his arm. You couldn't have known. Gabriel looked down at her hand, then met her gaze directly. In the lamplight, his eyes were a softer blue than usual, vulnerable in a way she had rarely seen. I should have trusted her judgment. If I had listened, we can't change the past, Charlotte said gently, but we can honor Marie's work by finishing what she started. Gabriel covered her hand with his own, the contact sending an unexpected warmth through Charlotte's body. Thank you, he said simply. The moment stretched between them, coordinated with unspoken emotions. Charlotte became acutely aware of their proximity, of the lateness of the hour, of how far they had traveled from the formal arm's-length arrangement that had characterized the beginning of their marriage. Gabriel seemed to realize it too, for he slowly withdrew his hand and straightened. We should both get some rest, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. As he gathered Marie's papers, Charlotte noticed a small photograph that had been tucked among them, a portrait of a woman with striking features, her dark hair arranged in a simple but elegant style, her expression both dignified and warm. Beside her stood a young girl of perhaps 4, with her mother's eyes and a smile of pure joy. Marie and Emma, Gabriel confirmed, seeing Charlotte's gaze. This was taken about a month before they fell ill. Charlotte studied the image, finally putting faces to the names that had haunted Sterling Ridge for so long. She was beautiful, she said softly. They both were. Yes. Gabriel carefully returned the photograph to the portfolio. They were my whole world. The simple declaration, spoken without drama or elaboration, conveyed more about Gabriel's loss than any lengthy eulogy could have. Charlotte felt her heart ache for him, for the life he had built and lost, for the man who had retreated into isolation rather than risk such pain again. I never thanked you, she said impulsively as he turned to leave. Gabriel paused at the door. For what? For saving me from Thorne that night in the alley, for offering me shelter and protection when you had no obligation to do so, for treating me with respect rather than as a burden. Something shifted in Gabriel's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of the perpetual tension he carried in his shoulders. You have more than repaid any debt with your work on this investigation, he replied. Your insights have been invaluable. It wasn't quite what Charlotte had hoped to hear, but she recognized that emotional expression remained difficult for Gabriel. The fact that he had shared Marie's personal papers, that he had sought out her company at this late hour, spoke more than words. Good night, Gabriel, she said deliberately, using his given name. He hesitated briefly before responding. Good night, Charlotte. After he left, Charlotte returned to the window, her thoughts even more unsettled than before. Their investigation was accelerating towards some inevitable confrontation with Thorne, fraught with danger and uncertainty. Yet amid these external threats, she found herself increasingly preoccupied with a more personal question. When this was over, what would become of her unusual marriage to Gabriel Sterling? The answer, she suspected, would depend on whether either of them was brave enough to acknowledge what was slowly developing between them, a connection that had begun as duty but was evolving into something neither had anticipated.
The next morning brought news that abruptly shifted their plans. One of Gabriel's hands returned from Redemption Valley with word that Thorne was planning a major announcement at the town council meeting that evening, rumored to be about a development that would transform the valley's fortunes. "It has to be the railroad," Gabriel concluded as they gathered in his study. "He's making his move earlier than we anticipated." Why now? Charlotte wondered. What's forcing his hand? Reed, who had been preparing to depart for Tucson, suggested a troubling possibility. Maybe he knows we're investigating him. After the incident at the Hayes cabin, he must realize someone is gathering evidence. Or he's finally secured enough properties along the proposed route to go public, Gabriel countered. Either way, we need to be at that meeting. Charlotte nodded in agreement. If he's announcing the railroad publicly, he'll likely present himself as the valley's benefactor, bringing progress and prosperity. It would be the perfect opportunity to challenge him with what we know. In front of the whole town, Reed asked skeptically. That's a risky play. Thorne won't go down without a fight, and he'll have his supporters there. Which is precisely why it's the right venue, Gabriel argued. Too public for his men to resort to violence, with enough witnesses that he can't simply dismiss our accusations. They spent the day preparing, organizing their evidence, drafting a statement detailing Thorne's crimes, and sending word to Sarah to ensure Thomas Nighthawk would be present with his samples. By late afternoon, everything was ready, except for one crucial element. Gabriel insisted that Charlotte remain at Sterling Ridge. "It's too dangerous," he maintained, as they stood on the porch, the wagon already prepared for the journey to town. "Thorne knows you're connected to the Hayes property. If he suspects you've found the affidavit, all the more reason for me to be there," Charlotte interrupted firmly. "This isn't just your fight, Gabriel. Thorne is responsible for Jonathan's death, just as he is for Marie and Emma's. I have every right to face him." Gabriel's jaw tightened with frustration. "I'm not questioning your right. I'm concerned for your safety." "As I am for yours," Charlotte countered. "But we're stronger together than apart. You know that." Their gazes locked in silent battle, neither willing to yield. Finally, Gabriel sighed, a sound of reluctant capitulation. "Stay close to me at all times," he instructed. "If anything goes wrong, you follow Reed's lead and get to safety. No heroics." Charlotte nodded, relieved that he had conceded without requiring a more explicit promise she might not be able to keep. The truth was, she had no intention of retreating if Gabriel was in danger, a realization that both surprised and unsettled her. When had his welfare become so important to her? The town hall was already crowded. When they arrived in Redemption Valley, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Thorne had spared no expense for the occasion, providing refreshments and decorations that lent a festive air to the proceedings. He himself stood near the front of the room, resplendent in an expensive suit, greeting townsfolk with the practiced charm of a politician. Charlotte felt Gabriel tense beside her as they entered his hand, instinctively moving to the small of her back in what had become a familiar gesture of protective support. Reed followed close behind, scanning the crowd for potential threats. They took seats near the middle of the room, visible but not conspicuous. Sarah and Thomas Nighthawk were already present, seated toward the back, where their mixed heritage would attract less attention. Sarah caught Charlotte's eye briefly, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. Reverend Whitaker occupied a place of honor near the front, alongside other prominent citizens, the doctor, the schoolmaster, the merchant, Abernathy. At precisely 7 o'clock, Mayor Collins called the meeting to order, his round face flushed with excitement. "Citizens of Redemption Valley," he began pompously, "we are gathered for a most momentous announcement. Our esteemed friend and benefactor, Mr. Harrison Thorne, has news that will usher our humble community into a new era of prosperity. Polite applause followed as Thorne took the mayor's place at the front of the room. Charlotte studied him carefully, his immaculate appearance, his confident posture, the calculating intelligence in his eyes that belied his benevolent smile. How had she not recognized the predator beneath the polished exterior? "Friends and neighbors," Thorne began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "For 8 years I have had the privilege of calling Redemption Valley my home. I've watched this community grow from a scattered settlement to a thriving town with unlimited potential." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep the room, briefly passing over Charlotte and Gabriel without any sign of recognition or concern. "Today, I am pleased to announce that this potential will soon be fully realized. The Southern Pacific Railroad has approved plans for a spur line connecting Redemption Valley to the main transcontinental route." The room erupted in cheers and exclamations of surprise. A railroad connection would indeed transform the valley's economy, bringing markets for cattle and crops within easy reach, along with manufactured goods from the east. Property values would soar, businesses would multiply, the benefits were undeniable. Thorne raised his hands, calming the excited chatter. "Construction will begin within 6 months, with completion expected by the end of next year. I have been working closely with Southern Pacific officials to ensure the route serves our community's needs while respecting existing property boundaries wherever possible." A convenient qualification, Charlotte noted. Wherever possible provided ample room for exceptions that would undoubtedly benefit Thorne's holdings. Furthermore, Thorne continued, his smile broadening, "I am establishing the Redemption Valley Development Company, which will manage growth along the rail corridor. As a gesture of my commitment to this community, I am offering founding shares in this venture to all current property owners, ensuring that everyone benefits from this progress." More applause followed, though Charlotte noticed some skeptical expressions among the older ranchers who had likely witnessed similar opportunities in other territories. Gabriel remained stone-faced beside her, his eyes never leaving Thorne. "Questions?" Thorne invited, as the applause died down. Several hands went up, and Thorne began addressing predictable inquiries about the exact route, construction timeline, and investment opportunities. Charlotte felt the tension building, and Gabriel sensed he was preparing to rise and confront Thorne. She placed a restraining hand on his arm, silently urging patience. Timing was crucial. Finally, during a brief lull in the questions, Gabriel stood. The movement immediately drew Thorne's attention, his expression flickering almost imperceptibly before resuming its affable mask. "Ah, Mr. Sterling," Thorne acknowledged smoothly. "I'm pleased you could join us for this historic occasion. I understand the proposed route crosses a portion of your southern grazing lands. Rest assured, Southern Pacific offers generous compensation for necessary easements." "I'm not concerned about compensation, Mr. Thorne," Gabriel replied, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I'm more interested in the methods you employ to secure properties along your chosen routes." A murmur ran through the crowd. Thorne's smile tightened slightly. "I'm not sure I take your meaning, sir." "Then allow me to be more direct," Gabriel continued, taking a step into the center aisle. "How many property owners along this route experienced mysterious water contamination before selling to your agents? How many suffered unexplained livestock deaths or crop failures that forced them to accept your offers?" The room fell silent, all eyes moving between Gabriel and Thorne. The latter's expression hardened, though his smile remained fixed in place. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Sterling. I hope you have something to substantiate them beyond personal grievance." "I do. Gabriel nodded to Reed, who stood and approached the front of the room carrying the portfolio of evidence they had compiled, including an affidavit sworn by Alistair Finch and witnessed by William Hayes, detailing how you orchestrated the murder of your former partner James Whitfield and framed your own brother for the crime. Gasps and whispers erupted throughout the hall. Thorne's smile vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "A preposterous forgery," he declared. "I don't know what game you're playing, Sterling, but making such libelous claims in a public forum is ill-advised." "It's no game," Charlotte said, rising to stand beside Gabriel. "The affidavit is genuine, as is the evidence compiled by Marie Sterling before her death, documenting the pattern of water contamination across the valley. Contamination that claimed her life and the life of their daughter Emma." And Thorne's gaze shifted to Charlotte, recognition and something like amusement crossing his features. "Ah, the widow Hayes, or should I say Mrs. Sterling. How convenient that you've found a protector with such compatible grievances." He turned back to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret that this joyous announcement has been marred by these baseless accusations. Mr. Sterling has opposed progress in our valley since his arrival, preferring isolation to community prosperity." Several voices murmured in agreement, particularly among Thorne's business associates in the front rows. Charlotte felt the momentum shifting away from them. Thorne was skilled at manipulation, at casting himself as the reasonable party, while painting Gabriel as an obstructionist outsider. It was time for their final witness. Charlotte caught Sarah's eye and nodded slightly. Sarah leaned toward her uncle, whispering something that prompted the old man to rise from his seat. "The Apache have watched the water-taker for many seasons," Thomas Nighthawk declared, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "We have collected the poison he leaves, marked the places where death follows his shadow." All eyes turned to the elderly Native American as he approached the front of the room, his dignity commanding attention, despite the prejudice many in Redemption Valley harbored toward his people. From his pocket, he produced several of the vials Charlotte had seen the night before. "This from Peterson Ranch before cattle die. This from Miller Place before children sicken. This from Sterling Ridge South, well before woman and child die." He set each vial on the table before Thorne. "Same poison, same hand, same purpose." Thorne's composure slipped momentarily, genuine anger flashing in his eyes. "The ramblings of an old Indian," he said dismissively. "Hardly evidence a court would consider." "Perhaps not alone," Gabriel agreed, "but combined with documented financial records, witness testimonies, and the suspicious timing of Jonathan Hayes's death immediately after he retrieved his father's Bible containing the affidavit, a territorial judge might take a different view." The mention of Jonathan's death brought Thorne's attention back to Charlotte. "Your husband took his own life, Mrs. Sterling. A tragic consequence of his war injuries and financial failures. Attempting to transform his suicide into murder does his memory no service." Charlotte felt a surge of anger at Thorne's casual dismissal of Jonathan's death and his implicit accusation that she was somehow dishonoring her first husband's memory. "Jonathan was recovering," she said, her voice steady despite her emotions. "His business was improving. He had no reason to take his life unless someone helped him do so." Mayor Collins, visibly uncomfortable with the direction the meeting had taken, attempted to intervene. "Perhaps we should adjourn and allow these serious matters to be addressed through proper legal channels." "No," Thorne interrupted sharply. "I will not leave such accusations unanswered." He turned back to Gabriel, his mask of civility dropping away entirely. "You've nursed your grievances in isolation for too long, Sterling. Your wife died of the same fever that claimed a dozen others that summer. A tragedy, certainly, but not murder. and certainly not my doing. Then you won't object to a formal investigation, Gabriel pressed. An examination of these samples by qualified experts, a review of property transfers along the proposed rail route testimony from those who've experienced convenient misfortunes before selling to your agents. Thorne's eyes narrowed dangerously. Be careful, Sterling. Even if these absurd claims had merit, which they do not, you forget who controls the law in this territory. Judge Williams is an old friend. Sheriff Brodie is on my payroll. The governor himself has invested in my development ventures. He smiled coldly. Who exactly will conduct this investigation you propose? The naked admission of corruption silenced the room. Charlotte felt a chill at the confidence with which Thorne dismissed their evidence, not by denying the accusations, but by declaring himself beyond the reach of justice. Before Gabriel could respond, the town hall doors burst open. A man Charlotte recognized as Luis Martinez, the clerk Sarah had mentioned, staggered in, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "He tried to kill me," Martinez gasped, pointing a trembling finger at Thorne. "When he found I'd taken the papers, the real railroad plans—" Two shots rang out in rapid succession. Martinez crumpled to the floor as screams erupted throughout the hall. At the door stood Finch Thorne's enforcer, a smoking pistol in his hand. Chaos exploded in the crowded room. People scrambled for cover, overturning chairs and tables. Reed moved with remarkable speed. For a man his age, drawing his own weapon and firing at Finch, forcing the gunman to retreat outside. Gabriel pushed Charlotte toward Sarah, who was already helping her uncle take shelter behind an overturned table. "Stay down," he ordered, his expression grim as he drew the revolver he carried beneath his coat. "Gabriel?" Charlotte began, fear constricting her throat. "I'll be back," he promised, squeezing her hand briefly before turning toward the front of the room where Thorne was making for a side exit. Everything happened with disorienting speed. Gabriel intercepted Thorne near the door, grappling with him briefly before both men disappeared into the adjoining room. More gunshots sounded from outside as Reed exchanged fire with Finch and possibly other gunmen. The mayor and several council members cowered behind the speaker's podium, while Reverend Whitaker attempted to usher women and children toward the relative safety of a storage room. Charlotte's heart pounded in her ears as she crouched behind the table with Sarah and Thomas. She couldn't see, Gabriel couldn't know if he was safe, or if Thorne had turned the tables on him. The uncertainty was unbearable. "I have to find Gabriel," she said, already moving to rise. Sarah caught her arm. "It's too dangerous. There are armed men." "I can't just wait here," Charlotte interrupted, her resolve hardening. "Gabriel needs help." Before Sarah could protest further, Charlotte slipped away, keeping low as she moved toward the side door where Gabriel and Thorne had disappeared. The adjoining room was a small office used by the town clerk, now dark and seemingly empty. Charlotte paused at the threshold, straining to hear any sound that might indicate where the men had gone. A crash from above suggested they had moved to the building's second floor. Charlotte found a narrow staircase behind the clerk's desk and ascended cautiously, acutely aware of her vulnerability. She had no weapon, no plan beyond finding Gabriel and ensuring his safety. The upper level consisted of a large storage room filled with boxes of records and town supplies. Moonlight streamed through a single window, casting long shadows across the cluttered space. Charlotte moved carefully between stacks of crates, listening for movement. A floorboard creaked to her right. She froze, barely breathing. "Mrs. Sterling," Thorne's voice came from the shadows, silky and controlled. "How devoted you are to your new husband. One might almost believe the arrangement genuine." Charlotte remained silent, trying to pinpoint his location. Where was Gabriel? "He's alive, if that's what you're wondering," Thorne continued conversationally. For now, I find myself in a difficult position, you see. Killing you both would be simplest, but explaining 2 more deaths might prove challenging, even with my connections." A beam of moonlight illuminated him briefly, as he moved between crates enough for Charlotte to see the revolver in his hand and the calculating expression on his face. He was stalking her methodically, using his voice to flush her from hiding. "Perhaps we could reach an accommodation," he suggested. "The Sterling Ridge water rights are what I truly need. The grazing land is secondary. You could persuade your husband to be reasonable to accept generous compensation. Everyone benefits. No one else needs to die." Charlotte edged backward, searching desperately for Gabriel. She found him slumped against the far wall, a dark stain spreading across his shirt, wounded but alive, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Relief and terror flooded her simultaneously. "No deal, Thorn," she replied, deliberately projecting her voice away from Gabriel's position. "You've killed enough people. It ends tonight." Thorn laughed softly. "Brave words, Mrs. Sterling. But the situation remains unchanged. I control this valley. One way or another, I will have what I need for the railroad." "The railroad that isn't coming," a new voice interjected from the stairwell. Charlotte turned to see Reed ascending the last steps, his gun trained steadily on Thorn. Behind him came Sarah, and behind her, to Charlotte's astonishment, Reverend Whitaker. "What are you talking about?" Thorn demanded, his confidence wavering for the first time. Reed smiled grimly. "Martinez was bringing proof that Southern Pacific rejected your proposed spur line 3 months ago. The documents you've been showing investors are forgeries." "Lies," Thorn hissed, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "The territorial governor received official confirmation last week." Whitaker added, his ministerial bearing lending authority to his words. "I have a brother on the Railroad Commission. He wrote to warn me that Thorn was selling shares in a non-existent venture." Charlotte used the distraction to move toward Gabriel, kneeling beside him, to assess his wound. A bullet had grazed his side, painful and bleeding freely, but not immediately life-threatening. His eyes met hers, clouded with pain, but alert. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered hoarsely. "Neither should you," she replied, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the wound. Thorn, realizing he was cornered, grew more dangerous. "It doesn't matter," he snarled. "I still control enough of this territory to rebuild. This setback is temporary." "No, Harrison," Whitaker said solemnly. "Your time in Redemption Valley is over. The governor has ordered an investigation into your business dealings based on evidence provided by Ms. Nighthawk's uncle and others who have suffered from your methods." Thorn's face contorted with rage. With startling quickness, he raised his gun and fired at Whitaker. The Reverend staggered backward, but remained standing as Reed returned fire, forcing Thorn to dive behind a stack of crates. Gabriel struggled to rise, retrieving his fallen revolver. "Get out of here," he urged Charlotte. "All of you. I'll handle Thorn." "Not alone," Charlotte insisted, helping him to a more defensible position behind a heavy desk. Gunfire erupted again as Thorn shot blindly toward Reed's position. In the confined space, the sound was deafening, the muzzle flashes momentarily blinding. Charlotte felt Gabriel's arm encircle her protectively, pulling her closer to the floor. A lull fell as both sides reloaded. In that brief silence, Charlotte heard a new sound, the crackling of flames. One of the muzzle flashes had ignited a stack of papers, and fire was spreading rapidly among the dry records and wooden crates. "Fire!" Sarah called out, already helping Whitaker toward the stairs. "We need to get out!" Smoke began filling the room, thick and choking. Through watering eyes, Charlotte saw Thorne making for the window, abandoning the fight in favor of escape. Gabriel saw it too, and raised his revolver, but his injured state affected his aim. The shot went wide. Thorne reached the window and threw it open, preparing to climb onto the adjacent roof. But as he straddled the sill, he turned back, unable to resist a final taunt. "This isn't over, Sterling," he called through the thickening smoke. "Not while I'm breathing." It was a mistake. The moment's delay gave Reed a clear shot. His bullet caught Thorne in the shoulder, spinning him partially around. Thorne lost his balance, his arms windmilling as he teetered on the windowsill. For a suspended moment, his eyes met Charlotte's across the burning room wide, with the sudden recognition of his own mortality. Then he was falling backward, a cry torn from his throat that ended abruptly with a sickening thud on the street below. "We have to go," Gabriel urged, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. "The whole building could go up." Together, they made their way to the stairs, Reed covering their retreat in case any of Thorne's men remained. The main hall was already empty, the townsfolk having fled when the shooting started. Outside, a crowd had gathered at a safe distance, watching as flames began to lick at the town hall's upper windows. A stillness fell over the crowd as Charlotte emerged, supporting Gabriel, his blood staining her dress where he leaned against her. Behind them came Reed, Sarah, and Reverend Whitaker, all soot-streaked and coughing. Near the base of the building lay Thorne's body, twisted at unnatural angles from the fall. Sheriff Brodie knelt beside it, checking futilely for signs of life. The sheriff looked up as they approached, his expression a mixture of shock and calculation as he assessed the new power dynamics taking shape before him. "What happened up there?" he demanded, his hand hovering near his gun. Before Gabriel could respond, Reverend Whitaker stepped forward. "Harrison Thorne attempted to murder us all to conceal his crimes," he stated firmly. "The territorial governor will receive a full accounting of tonight's events, along with the evidence of Thorne's many other transgressions." The implicit threat was clear. Brodie could either align himself with the emerging truth or face investigation for his own complicity in Thorne's operations. After a moment's hesitation, the sheriff's hand moved away from his weapon. "I'll need statements from all of you," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "once the doctor has seen to Mr. Sterling's wound." It was a small capitulation, but significant, the first indication that Thorne's hold on Redemption Valley had truly been broken. As Dr. Miller approached to examine Gabriel, Charlotte felt the adrenaline that had sustained her beginning to ebb, leaving exhaustion in its wake. The night's violence, the confrontation with Thorne, the fire, it all seemed dreamlike now, as if she were observing events from a distance. Only Gabriel's presence beside her solid, despite his injury, anchored her to reality. She tightened her arm around his waist, and he responded by drawing her closer against his side, propriety forgotten in the aftermath of danger. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough from smoke and concern. Charlotte nodded, unable to form words past the tightness in her throat. They had survived. Thorne was dead. The immediate threat had passed. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unresolved between them, some final reckoning as consequential in its way as the one they had just faced. "I thought I'd lost you," she finally managed the admission, barely audible. Gabriel's arm tightened around her. "I made you a promise," he replied simply. "I keep my promises." It wasn't a declaration of love, not in conventional terms. But as they stood together amid the chaos of a town forever changed by the night's events, Charlotte recognized it for what it was, an acknowledgement that what had begun as an arrangement of necessity had become something neither of them had anticipated or sought, yet both now cherished. The future stretched before them, uncertain, but filled with possibilities that hadn't existed before. Redemption Valley would rebuild. Sterling Ridge would continue. And perhaps in time, the wounds of the past might finally begin to heal. The rain that fell on Redemption Valley 3 days later seemed fitting, a cleansing downpour that washed away the ashes of the town hall fire and dampened the freshly turned earth of Harrison Thorne's grave. Few had attended the burial, most keeping a cautious distance from the deceased's legacy as revelations of his crimes continued to emerge. At Sterling Ridge, life had begun to assume a new rhythm. Gabriel's wound, while painful, was healing well under Martha's careful attention. Reed had departed for Tucson to meet with the territorial governor's representatives, carrying comprehensive documentation of Thorne's activities. Sarah and Thomas Nighthawk had returned to their normal routines, though they now received a different kind of acknowledgement from townsfolk who had witnessed the old man's courage at the town meeting. Charlotte found herself in a strange limbo. The immediate purpose that had driven her uncovering the truth about Jonathan's death and bringing Thorne to justice had been fulfilled. Yet her role at Sterling Ridge remained undefined. Was she still simply fulfilling an arrangement, or had their shared ordeal transformed their marriage into something genuine? Gabriel had been quiet since their return from town, his natural reserve deepened by physical pain and the emotional aftermath of confronting Thorne. They had not discussed the future, both seemingly content to allow the present to unfold without forcing definitions or commitments. On the fourth morning after the confrontation, Charlotte woke early, drawn outside by the freshness that follows heavy rain. The world seemed renewed, the colors more vibrant, the air sweeter. She walked to the small rise behind the house where Marie and Emma's graves were located, a place she had respectfully avoided until now. The markers were simple but dignified. 2 rounded headstones bearing names, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved wife and daughter forever in our hearts." Someone, Gabriel presumably, had planted wildflowers around the graves, creating a living memorial that bloomed in riotous color despite the recent rain. Charlotte stood silently, paying respects to the woman and child whose loss had shaped Gabriel's life so profoundly. She felt no jealousy toward Marie, only a deep gratitude for the love and family she had given Gabriel during their time together, and perhaps a quiet hope that he might someday find room in his heart for new love. "I used to come here every morning." Gabriel's voice came from behind her, startling Charlotte from her thoughts. "For the first year after they died. Rain or shine, dawn." Charlotte turned to find him standing a few paces away, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "I'm sorry if I'm intruding," she said. "I just wanted to pay my respects." Gabriel shook his head, moving to stand beside her. "You're not intruding. I think Marie would have liked you. Your determination, your courage." The simple statement touched Charlotte deeply. "The flowers are beautiful," she observed. "Emma would have loved them." "Yes," Gabriel agreed, a small smile briefly softening his features. "She was always collecting bouquets, bringing home whatever blooms caught her eye." They stood in companionable silence for several minutes, the morning breeze rustling the flowers and tall grass around them. Charlotte felt a peculiar peace descend, not the absence of grief or loss, but the acceptance of it as part of a larger continuing story. "I received a letter from Judge Miller yesterday," Gabriel said eventually, "regarding our marriage." Charlotte tensed slightly, uncertain what was coming. "Oh, he asked about our intentions now that the circumstances that precipitated our arrangement have changed." Gabriel's voice was carefully neutral. "He offered to begin dissolution proceedings if that was our wish." The moment Charlotte had both anticipated and dreaded had arrived. Their marriage had served its original purpose, she was safe from Thorn, and Gabriel had fulfilled his promise to Jonathan. There was no longer any practical necessity binding them together, except perhaps the feelings that had developed between them, feelings neither had openly acknowledged. "What did you tell him?" Charlotte asked, her heart beating faster despite her outward calm. Gabriel turned to face her fully, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "I told him I needed to consult my wife, that this decision belonged to both of us." The simplicity of his response and the respect it conveyed moved Charlotte deeply. "And what does Gabriel Sterling want?" she asked softly. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the subtle variations of blue in his eyes, the faint lines at their corners from years of squinting into the Arizona sun. "What I want," he said slowly, as if the words were unfamiliar, "is for you to stay. Not because of an arrangement or an obligation, but because you choose to." The directness of his statement took Charlotte's breath away. There was no flowery declaration, no passionate avowal of undying love, just a simple, honest expression of desire and hope, offered without demand or expectation. "What about you?" she countered gently. "Would you be staying out of choice or duty?" Gabriel's gaze never wavered. "When I believed Thorn had shot you in that storage room, I realized something. The thought of losing you, it was like losing Marie and Emma again. But somehow worse, because this time I'd have squandered the second chance I never expected to receive." He took a deep breath. "I choose you, Charlotte. If you'll have me." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so unexpected and complete it bordered on pain. "I choose you too," she whispered. Gabriel reached for her, then his hand cupping her cheek, with a gentleness that belied its strength. Slowly giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them navigating unfamiliar territory. But as Charlotte responded, her arms encircling his waist, mindful of his healing wound, the kiss deepened into something neither hesitant nor demanding a promise freely given and joyfully received. When they finally separated, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly unsteady. "I'm not an easy man," he warned, a final offering of honesty. "The war, Marie and Emma, the years alone, they've left their marks." "And I'm not an uncomplicated woman," Charlotte replied, smiling through her tears. "Jonathan, the losses, the struggles, they're part of me." She drew back slightly to meet his gaze. "But perhaps that's why this works. We understand each other's scars." Gabriel nodded, a rare, full smile transforming his features. "Partners, then," he said, echoing the term they had used for their original arrangement, but investing it with new meaning. "In all things." "In all things," Charlotte agreed. As they walked hand in hand back toward the house, their home, Charlotte felt a sense of rightness settle over her. What had begun as a desperate bargain in a rain-soaked alley had evolved into something neither of them could have foreseen: a second chance at love, at family, at building a life together. Sterling Ridge would always carry echoes of the past: Marie and Emma's laughter, Jonathan's memory, the shadows of loss and grief that had shaped them both. But now, those echoes would be joined by new sounds: conversations over dinner, shared laughter, perhaps someday children's voices. Redemption Valley had lived up to its name, offering them both a chance to begin again, not by forgetting the past, but by honoring it while still moving forward into an unexpected future together.